Hey guys, tonight, we slip through the fog-drenched streets of Victorian England, where gas lights flicker like the last whispers of freedom and heavy boots echo off cobblestones wet with the day's rain. You're wearing a corset that crushes your lungs just enough to keep you obedient, and you're arm in arm with your brand new husband. You smile at passers-by. You curtsy when required. But behind your lashes, you're trying not to scream. Because tonight, we're diving into the chillingly legal powers Victorian husbands held over their wives. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where and when you're tuning in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the altar, heart fluttering. The air smells like beeswax, old wood, and something sharp beneath the roses. The priest recites vows that sound familiar until they don't. With a murmured, "I do," your world disappears, not metaphorically, not romantically. Legally, you're not you anymore. You're him. At least that's how coverture works. It's 1842. You marry and the law now sees you as a single merged entity, and that entity is your husband. Coverture is the doctrine that in the eyes of English common law erases a married woman's legal identity. The second that ring slides onto your finger, your right to own property, sign contracts, or even keep wages ceases to exist. You've been absorbed, legally devoured. The phrase used back then, her legal existence is suspended. Cute, right? Historians still argue whether coverture was purely patriarchal suppression or a misguided relic of feudal unity, but either way, the outcome was the same. You don't exist anymore. Not really. You're now the legal equivalent of furniture with opinions. So let's say you owned a small inheritance before marriage, a tidy sum left by an aunt who loved your sharp wit. That fortune now his. He can gamble it, drink it, or invest it poorly in steam-powered lawnmowers. You can't even complain because you can't sue him. You are him. In one particularly eerie example from 1851, a woman named Sarah Ward tried to reclaim the rights to her own publishing profits. Her husband had been pocketing the income from her poems sold under his name, of course. The court's answer, laughter and dismissal. After all, who did she think she was a person? The only exception to coverture, and this is almost laughably ironic, is criminal prosecution. If your husband commits a crime and drags you along the court, might punish you too because you're close enough to be blamed, but not quite real enough to be protected. A lovely little legal paradox. And forget bank accounts. They didn't even have Mrs. Options. Your money becomes his the moment it's touched. You could be a brilliant dressmaker with clientele from Kensington to Bath, but legally, every stitch you sew fills his coffers. Now picture this, he buys a pony. On credit. Can't pay. The creditors come after you because the pony lives in your stables and the house is technically his, and you are legally irrelevant. You might be forcibly evicted, blamed, or worse, all without signing a single paper. Here's your fun fringe tidbit for tonight. Some women desperate for autonomy would try to trick the system. There are cases where wives used fake names, adopted male pseudonyms, or even funneled money into secret drawers hidden behind fireplaces. One woman in 1867 was caught running an underground apothecary under the name Dr. Thornwell. She wasn't a doctor nor a Thornwell. She was just tired of being legally invisible. And the law didn't just ignore your autonomy, it reinforced your dependency. Say you wanted to buy something, anything from a tea kettle to a second-hand pianoforte. You needed his signature, not his permission, his literal legal signature. Without it, no shopkeeper would even consider the transaction valid. Even your own death required his oversight. If you died married, your will could be completely invalidated if it contradicted his property claims. So yes, in case you were wondering, even your final wishes could be vetoed with a sigh and a shrug. And yet this horrifyingly complete erasure was often presented as romantic. Victorian etiquette books would describe marriage as a blending of souls. You became one being, a noble fusion. Conveniently, the one being was male, and you got to be the spiritual garnish. The absurdity of coverture reached its pinnacle in something called the spousal privilege. It's supposed to be a good thing. It means a wife couldn't testify against her husband in court. Sounds sweet until you realize it was less about protecting you and more about preventing any evidence from undermining him. So let's do a recap before you faint in your corset. Under coverture, your body isn't yours. Your money isn't yours. Your name isn't yours. And your legal status, that belongs to him too. Oh, and if you don't marry, society calls you a spinster, assumes you're sexually frustrated, and limits your ability to rent, work, or travel independently. So really, your only freedom is to choose how you want to be legally oppressed. But let's be fair for contrast's sake. There were outliers. A few trailblazing women challenged coverture head-on. Take Barbara Lee Smith Bodachon, a firecracker of a woman who co-founded the Married Women's Property Committee in 1855. She argued that women weren't merging into men, but vanishing into them, and she had the receipts to prove it. Her pamphlet, with the dry but deadly title, A Brief Summary of the Laws of England Concerning Women, laid bare every grotesque detail of coverture, and Victorian society was scandalized. Still, reform was molasses slow. For decades, the doctrine remained law, thick as chimney soot and just as suffocating. So tonight, as you slip deeper under your sheets, imagine lying beside someone who, by legal definition, has consumed your very identity. You smile. You whisper goodnight. But inside, you're trying to remember who you used to be before you were legally erased. You wake to the sound of horses clattering past your townhouse window, carriages creaking through the murk of a London dawn. You stretch momentarily, forgetful, and then it hits you. You're still married. You're still vanished. And today you're going to learn just how far that invisibility stretches. Under coverture, you're not just legally erased, you're also presumed endlessly available. Which brings us to something even more disquieting, the Victorian marital rape loophole. Or more accurately, the marital rape non-existence. Because in Victorian law, rape inside a marriage wasn't just unprosecutable, it wasn't possible. Not conceptually, not linguistically, not legally. The logic was crystalline in its coldness. When you marry, you give your consent once forever. That's it. A one-time transaction. No refunds, no renegotiations, no revocations. It's like signing an eternal lease on your body, and the landlord doesn't take holidays. Sir Matthew Hale, a 17th century jurist, whose writings still shaped Victorian legal philosophy, put it plainly: the husband cannot be guilty of a rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife. That sentence echoed for centuries, like a grim lullaby with no end. So let's say it's 1856, and your husband comes home from the pub in a foul mood. You say no. You plead. Maybe you lock the bedroom door. None of it matters. If he forces himself on you, no one, not the law, not the courts, not even your doctor, will call it rape. They'll call it marital relations. They'll call it your duty. Historians still argue whether this belief stemmed more from religious doctrine or property law. But the result is the same: you have no legal sovereignty over your own body. And don't think Victorian society didn't notice. There's a fringe tidbit buried in an 1872 pamphlet by a radical suffragist group in Manchester. It describes a so-called marriage night horror. A story passed in whispers, not newspapers, where a young wife locked herself in the coal cellar to to escape her husband on their wedding night. He broke the door down. She was found days later, mute, still covered in soot. No charges were ever filed. The medical community chimed in with its usual cocktail of pity and gaslighting. Women who reported pain or distress from marital sex were often diagnosed with hysteria, a convenient umbrella term that meant everything and nothing. The treatment: bed rest, ice water baths, sometimes a mild sedative, but never legal action. And then there were the marriage manuals books meant to guide husbands in their bedroom behavior. Some offered tender advice. Others read more like blueprints for dominance. One popular 1869 guide, The Duties of the Christian Husband, advised men to treat their wives firmly but affectionately and to disregard moments of unreasonable resistance. You lie there still as a portrait pretending to sleep. You memorize the cracks in the ceiling, counting them like a rosary. Your husband's breath is slow beside you, alcohol-laced and content. He gets to sleep peacefully. You get to endure. The worst part, there were women who spoke up bravely, clearly, and were dismissed as delusional. In 1884, an anonymous woman submitted a letter to the English Woman's Review describing her nightly torment at the hands of a man who no longer waits for yes or no. The letter was real. Her pain was real. The editor's reply: marriage brings both comfort and sacrifice. So yes, even sympathetic ears still found ways to blame you for your own legal exposure. Imagine this scenario: you try to bring a case to court. You plead not for a charge of rape you know better, but for a separation due to cruelty. The judge nods along, half listening, and then asks if your husband provides financially. When you say yes, the case is dismissed, because after all, he feeds you. What more could you possibly want? And the social implications. They're sharp as corset stays. Victorian society treated marital duty as sacred. If you spoke of sexual distress, you were either a liar or frigid. If you refused your husband, you were unnatural. And if you resisted him physically, well, that could get you locked away, for your mental instability. Here's something almost cartoonish in one legal text from the 1860s. A judge cited a husband's sexual persistence as evidence that the wife was at fault for the marriage's collapse. She had denied him his marital rights, as if that were worse than any violence he could inflict. And the term marital rights is really doing some sinister heavy lifting here. Let's shift the lens for a second. Imagine you're a man in the same era. You marry expecting cheerful submission and quiet affection. But your wife says no. Maybe she says it once, maybe often. Legally, this refusal is borderline insubordination. You tell a friend who tells you, take what's yours. She'll come around. You do. And no one stops you. Not the courts, not your neighbors, not even your priest. Because she said, I do, and that means she did forever. Now here's your odd little historical morsel. There was a fleeting proposal in the House of Commons in 1870 to reconsider the permanence of marital consent. It came from a liberal backbencher named William Lawson, who reportedly brought it up half as a joke. The chamber laughed. The motion was never written down. The idea consent after marriage was too absurd to take seriously. You can't unhear that laughter. So where does that leave you listening now, tucked in bed, perhaps warm and safe? Still a shiver lingers. Because if you'd been born just a century or so earlier, even your no would have vanished in the legal void of marriage. You would have been a ghost in your own bed. And remember, this wasn't ancient history. It wasn't repealed in Britain until the 1990s. That's not Victorian. That's alarmingly recent. So sleep tight. And maybe tonight, spare a dream for every woman who whispered no and wasn't heard. You come down the staircase one morning, hair-pinned, neatly apron dusted of flour, and you notice the deadbolt on the parlor door locked. You hadn't locked it, and the window shutters bolted tight from the outside. You walk from room to room, every door clicks, every latch holds. Something sinks in your gut. You realize with an eerie calm that you are not allowed to leave. Not today. Not ever again unless he says so. Because under Victorian law, your husband can legally confine you to your home. It's not kidnapping. It's not wrongful imprisonment. It's lawful authority. He can bar the doors, take the keys, instruct the servants never to let you out. And no one, no policeman, no magistrate, not even your father, can force him to open them. Imagine that a cage built from social norms, legal precedent, and good British oak. The legal reasoning is astonishingly simple. Under coverture, the husband is not just your spouse, he's your guardian. And what do guardians do when their wards are misbehaving, or making scenes, or walking too much unchaperoned? They restrict them. For your own good, of course. Historians still argue whether this power to confine stemmed more from common law tradition, or was more a symptom of patriarchal panic over female independence. But either way, the result was the same women across Britain found themselves locked in their own homes with no law to rescue them. There's a famous case from 1864, the Ellen Orton confinement affair. Ellen's husband, a minor aristocrat, grew convinced she was too talkative at social events. So he ordered the servants to restrict her movements and had the nursery converted into a quiet room. She spent 3 years in that room. No charges were ever filed. When her sister attempted to intervene, a magistrate ruled that the husband's domestic dominion must be respected. 3 years. In a room with faded wallpaper and a single window that didn't open. And remember, the husband could always play the madness card. If you objected too much, if you kicked at the door or begged through the keyhole, he could easily escalate. Hysteria, he'd say. And just like that, the home prison becomes a prelude to the asylum. We'll get to that horror in a bit. But even without the asylum threat, the home confinement was enough. Enough to break your will, or at least slow it down until you stopped asking. In some cases, women were allowed to leave only for church services on Sundays, and only if escorted by a male servant or the husband himself. And even then, he might whisper to the vicar that you weren't quite yourself lately, just to remind everyone who really held the keys. The fringe tidbit for tonight. In one 1871 household account book, yes, Victorian men loved writing everything down. A husband listed his wife's movements as an expense. Not outings, not shopping trips. Movements. Each was tagged with a cost in shillings for the footman, the carriage, or any staff time required to manage her. You were quite literally a logistics problem. Let's pause and imagine your day. You try to open the front door. Locked. You open the sitting room windows, nailed shut. You ask the maid if you might walk to the market. She shakes her head, eyes cast low. Master's orders. You sit. You stare at your needlepoint. You try not to scream, because screaming would just be more evidence of your condition. And the worst part, it wasn't rare. Wealthy women were locked up in manors. Middle-class women were confined to drawing rooms. Working-class wives were trapped in tiny tenements, sometimes with doors literally bolted from the outside when husbands left for work. Even the literature of the day hinted at it. Take The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. A man imprisons his wife in an asylum to steal her inheritance, but before that he isolates her, breaks her spirit. The novel was fiction, but the practice standard operating procedure. Now you might ask, what about the police? Surely someone could help. But Victorian law enforcement operated on a principle of non-interference in domestic matters. If a woman was seen banging on an upstairs window, it was likely chalked up to female nerves. And if neighbors asked questions, the husband could invoke privacy. Or better yet, reputation. Because nothing shut down a Victorian inquiry faster than the threat of scandal. Here's a fun side note. In 1857, a London journalist published an exposé titled "A Lady's Cage," describing a home where the wife was never seen outdoors. The story caused minor ripples until the husband sued for defamation. The court ruled in his favor. She remained indoors. There were no ankle monitors back then, but the control was just as precise. Social shame kept your friends from asking. Legal silence kept the courts away. And your own isolation, it did the rest. Sometimes you were locked in to keep you from affairs. Sometimes to stop you from spending. Sometimes just because he didn't like your tone. The reason didn't matter. The right was his. Let's say you climb out a second-story window, lace up your boots, and run. What happens? You're returned like runaway property. Your husband might even be congratulated for his forgiveness. But you're now a flight risk, and the doors will close even tighter next time. And yes, this included pregnant women. One diary from 1859 tells of a woman 7 months along locked in for her safety while her husband went on a business trip. She miscarried. The servants had been instructed not to disturb her nap schedule. And here's where the sarcasm trickles in. What a lovely system for ensuring marital harmony. A literal lock and key. Because nothing says partnership like enforced captivity. You're probably wondering, when did this change? Slowly, painfully. There was no single law that banned husbands from confining wives. It simply faded as societal norms shifted, as women's rights edged forward, and as scandalous stories finally tipped the scales. But until well into the late 19th century, home imprisonment remained legal, even quietly accepted. So tonight, as you pull your blankets up under your chin, remember the front door you can walk through at any moment. That door didn't always belong to you. Not even a little. And if you ever feel trapped in your own life, truly deeply stuck, just know once upon a time, Victorian women were legally imprisoned in silence. No one noticed, no one cared, and no one came. There's something not right in the way your husband watches you. You can feel it not in the big moments, but in the quiet ones. The way he tilts his head when you laugh too long. The slight twitch in his eye when you forget to iron his cravat. The frown he doesn't hide when you read instead of mending. And then one day he calls for a doctor. "You haven't been sleeping," he says. "You've been weeping over nothing, talking too much, thinking too much." The doctor nods. "You're not examined. You're just diagnosed." And the next thing you know, you're in a carriage headed for a private asylum. No trial, no crime, no warning. Because in Victorian Britain, your husband can have you committed with nothing more than a signature and a story. Two medical men will nod, one might barely glance at you, and suddenly you're not a wife. You're a patient. You're insane. And there's nothing you can do. It's called the lunacy certificate, and it's terrifyingly easy to get if you're a man with a legal wife and a few coins to spare. The Lunacy Acts of 1845 and 1853 were supposed to create oversight, but in practice they gave husbands even more streamlined control over the mental fate of their wives, especially if they had money to gain. Historians still argue whether the asylums were a well-intentioned humanitarian development or simply stylish prisons for inconvenient people, but one thing is certain: many Victorian women were committed not for madness, but for rebellion. Your symptoms might include refusing sex, talking about books, too much crying at dinner, disliking your in-laws, eating irregularly, or wanting to leave the house too often. Basically, existing inconveniently. Take the infamous case of Rosina Bulwer-Lytton, yes, the wife of that Bulwer-Lytton, the writer who coined "It was a dark and stormy night." When Rosina publicly criticized her husband's politics, he retaliated by having her declared insane and shut away. She was forcibly removed by men who refused to tell her where they were taking her. Her offense, obstinate behavior. That's all it took. The medical establishment naturally played along. There was a whole buffet of invented female disorders ready to be slapped on a chart. Hysteria, of course. But also uterine melancholy, nymphomania, moral insanity, puerperal mania, religious delusion, and the beautifully vague overexcitement of the brain. In other words, if you had a uterus and weren't smiling, you were suspect. Once inside, your world shrinks. Your name is written on a clipboard. Your corset is removed, and your books are taken. You're instructed to remain calm, pleasant, and quiet, lest your behavior confirm the diagnosis. Some asylums, like the infamous Holloway Sanatorium, housed middle-class women in buildings that looked like country estates, complete with gardens and polite nurses. But the reality wasn't pastoral, it was procedural. You were told when to sleep, what to eat, when to speak, and to whom. Your mail was intercepted, your visitors were filtered, and every protest you made was just more proof. If you cried too much, you were melancholic. If you were calm, you were catatonic. If you refused to comply, you were violent. The fringe detail that will keep you up tonight. There were dedicated codes for wives in the registers, notations that essentially translated to husband, says she's unmanageable. It was practically a rubber stamp. Let's say you have a friend, Julia, who notices you've disappeared. She asks your husband. He shrugs, says you're ill. She asks again. He offers her a cup of tea and changes the subject. When she writes to the asylum, she's told visitation isn't appropriate. Why? Because your mental health is delicate, and because she's just a woman and not your next of kin. Legally, your husband still speaks for you even when you're locked away. Now you might be wondering, was there any way out? Technically, yes. You could appeal to the Lunacy Commission. But that required legal resources, a second advocate, and time. Most women didn't have one of those, let alone all three. And if your husband claimed you were suicidal or dangerous to children, your petition would be quietly buried under ongoing supervision required. Here's a real-world nightmare in one 1875 file from a rural asylum in Devon. A woman named Clara was locked away for unwifely behavior. No further explanation. Her husband remarried 2 years later, claiming she had died. She hadn't. She lived in that asylum for 31 years, never released. No family ever visited. You want a dark joke? When a woman did manage to prove her sanity and win release, some husbands recommitted them within a week. Why? Because now she was aggressive and delusionally angry. Imagine the rage of being silenced, then punished for making noise. And still, these places sold themselves as sanctuaries. One doctor described his asylum as a place of gentle rest for fatigued femininity. That fatigue, of course, was code for opinion or resistance or independence. One asylum matron even published a guidebook with the terrifyingly soft title on restoring the nervous wife. The opening line, "Some flowers must be kept in the shade to bloom." It wasn't just terrifying, it was poetic. Not all women broke. Some fought. Some found allies, doctors who bent the truth, friends who raised a scandal, sisters who refused to accept silence. But those stories were rare and quiet. So tonight, as you lie in your bed, lights low, imagine opening your eyes and seeing pale wallpaper and barred windows. No phone, no calendar, no idea what day it is. Just a nurse who calls you dear, a meal that tastes like paste, and a diagnosis that no one will ever bother to erase. You didn't commit a crime. You didn't lose your mind. You just lived in a time when your husband didn't need a reason to disappear you. He just needed a pen. There's a funeral today. Not yours, thankfully, But as you stand by the grave in a thin black veil, something lingers at the edge of your thoughts. You're not just mourning a neighbor. You're watching a quiet ritual unfold. The husband stands nearest the coffin, flanked by clergymen and legal men. The wife, now deceased, is spoken of fondly, gently, as if she were a well-used possession that finally wore out. And even in death, she is not free. Because under Victorian law, a woman's body, her literal corpse, was still considered her husband's property. Just like her legal identity in life, her physical remains belonged to him in death. He could choose where she was buried, whether she was embalmed, what dress she wore, whether she was interred next to her mother, or halfway across the country in a family plot he preferred. You were his, even when you weren't breathing. This legal concept was a lingering thread from coverture extended far past the wedding vow. In the Victorian view, a wife wasn't truly an independent person. She was a legal extension of the husband. So it makes perfect sense within that warped system that your body was never fully yours, not when you were born, not when you married, and not even when you finally escaped it. The law didn't even consider your wishes unless they were backed by his approval. So if you wrote a will requesting cremation or a Catholic funeral and your Protestant husband disagreed, guess what wins his conscience? Not yours. Historians still argue whether this power was formally enshrined in statute or just a chilling byproduct of legal custom, but the practice was widespread. Courts typically ruled in favor of the widower's decisions, even against the documented requests of the deceased. All under the logic that a wife's duty is to yield to her husband's judgment, even beyond the veil. You think I'm exaggerating? Let's talk about the preservation fad of the 1870s. Victorians, ever obsessed with sentimentality, and science, developed a taste for preserving the dead, especially wives. There are documented cases where men had their wives' corpses embalmed, dressed, and displayed in sealed glass coffins. One gentleman, Sir Cornelius Vellum, if you can believe the name, kept his wife's encased body in the drawing room for 6 months. He called her his jewel. Dinner guests were asked not to stare. Did she consent to that? Doesn't matter. She was his fringe tidbit. Some men went further. There were a few private collectors, mostly physicians, who kept casts or even preserved organs of their wives after death, claiming scientific curiosity or marital devotion. The most famous chemist in Bristol, who displayed his wife's brain in a bell jar for 22 years, with a plaque that read, "Seat of her patience." Charming. And here's where things get even more disturbing. If you died during childbirth, and many women did, your body was often inspected not by your physician, but by a panel appointed by your husband to determine whether you'd done anything wrong. Poor breathing, improper posture, emotional excitability. They weren't looking for medical errors. They were looking for someone to blame. You. Let's say your husband wanted to move the burial site 10 years later. He could petition to have your body exhumed and relocated. And if your parents protested, the courts usually waved it off. Blood ties meant less than marital bonds. Even if your own family raised you, loved you, paid for your dowry, and visited your grave every Sunday, he still had more legal claim over your bones than they did. Want to be buried in your favorite gown? Too bad. He might pick something else. Maybe something he liked more. Or maybe something that reminded him of how you looked at 17, back when he first decided you were pliable enough for his future. And what if you didn't want a Christian burial at all? Maybe you'd grown fond of spiritualism or pagan rites, or wanted to be planted in a forest with tree roots curling around your ribs. Victorian husbands had legal recourse to override that. In one case, from 1883, a woman's spiritualist friends tried to carry out her burial preferences. Her husband appeared at the cemetery with a constable and a churchman. He took the coffin away. The women were threatened with fines for religious fraud. The law nodded and moved on. Let's step even darker now, because this legal control over the body didn't just stop at death rituals. If you were ill, dangerously, terminally ill, and wanted to refuse a particular treatment, say bleeding or opium overdose or uterine rinsing, your consent didn't matter. If your husband said yes, it happened. And if you died from it, he signed the certificate, not you. There's a quote from an 1862 medical ethics book that sticks like a pin between the ribs. A husband's faith in remedy is sufficient when the wife's mind is compromised by pain. In other words, suffering made you untrustworthy. So he decided what to do with your body while it was still warm and cold. It gets worse when you consider anatomical donations. In some regions, if your husband approved, your body could be turned over to science regardless of your objections. There are recorded cases where husbands sold their wives' corpses to medical schools for profit. One even justified it by saying she would have wanted to be useful. No record suggests she ever said that. Imagine being cut open on a table in a teaching theater surrounded by students, sketching the architecture of your uterus and none of them knowing your name. Just Mrs. So-and-so provided by her widower. You can't scream. You're not there, but you still don't belong to yourself. And then there were wills. Say you managed to squirrel away a little something before death, an heirloom, a locked box, a letter. If your husband found it and claimed it was meant for him, despite clear language, otherwise the court would often defer to his greater understanding of her wishes. Translation, whatever he says goes. So you get to die, but not to decide what your death means. Tonight, as you lie still under your sheets, think of this, you breathe easily. You know that your body, even in death, is yours. You can leave a will. You can write your wishes down. You can say with finality, this is mine. But for the Victorian wife, her husband walked her to the grave, stood above it, and claimed her one last time. With the same voice that once said, I do. You're walking down a garden path. Sunlight dappled through vines when you see your neighbor's husband leaning too close to the housemaid. His hand brushes her back. She stiffens. Nothing more is said. A week later, the maid is gone and your neighbor, pale and polite, says only that marriage has its trials. You nod, sip your tea, and say nothing. Because in Victorian England, his infidelity isn't even considered news, but yours that could destroy you. Welcome to the legal asymmetry of adultery, where a man's wandering is indulged, and a woman's kiss is a courtroom scandal. Under Victorian law, adultery was a male privilege and a female crime. A man could seek sex outside the marriage bed and suffer no real consequence, social or legal. But if a wife even entertained the idea, she risked financial ruin, public shame, and permanent separation from her children. All codified, all court-approved. Let's talk numbers. In the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, the one that famously shifted divorce from Parliament into civil court grounds for divorce, were intentionally unequal. A man could divorce his wife for simple adultery. A woman, she had to prove adultery plus cruelty, incest, bigamy, desertion, or unnatural offenses. And yes, that meant exactly what you think. Historians still argue whether the lawmakers genuinely believed in female moral superiority or were simply protecting male reputations, but the bias is blatant. Victorian courts treated male infidelity as regrettable lapses. Female infidelity, moral collapse. And here's the twist: if your husband cheated, you couldn't sue the woman involved. But if you strayed, he could sue your lover for criminal conversation. That's right, he could drag the man into court and demand money. Not for heartbreak, for property damage. Because in legal terms, your body was his and someone else had used it. There's a documented case in 1862 where a husband sued his wife's lover for $5,000, a fortune back then. The judge ruled in his favor, calling the wife spoiled goods. She wasn't allowed to testify in her own defense, because legally, she was the thing being discussed. You were evidence, not a voice. Here's your fringe tidbit. During one scandalous 1870 divorce trial, a wife was accused of adultery based on a letter her husband claimed to find in her dresser. The court accepted it as valid despite shaky handwriting and no proof of mailing. Her defense: I never wrote it. The verdict: guilty. She lost her home, her children, and her dowry. Later, it was discovered her husband had paid the maid to forge it. Nothing changed. And the real kicker: divorce didn't free you. It destroyed you. Society might shrug at your husband's brothel visits, but a divorced woman, especially one found guilty of adultery, was marked. You could be denied housing, denied employment. Even charities refused to help you. In some towns, inns wouldn't rent you a room. And your children, they were automatically his. You could weep and plead and beg the court to let you see them. The court might sympathize, but it wouldn't act, because you were the unfaithful one, and the children by law needed to be protected from you. Picture this: a young mother named Alice caught in a loveless marriage to a cold, brutal man. She falls in love with someone kind. She doesn't sleep with him, but they write letters. Her husband finds them. He sues, wins. She loses her infant daughter, whom she nursed herself, and is forbidden to come within 100 feet of the home. She sees her child once again by accident 6 years later on a city street. The girl doesn't recognize her. And what if you don't actually commit adultery, but your husband says you did? You might still be punished. Courts often didn't require evidence as strict as you'd expect. A hotel registry, a suspicious maid's testimony, even a neighbor who saw you talking too intimately in a garden, it could all be spun into proof. If your husband was persuasive and you were emotional, the balance tipped fast. In fact, just being alone with a man could cause scandal. There's a case from 1859 where a woman was declared morally compromised for sharing a closed carriage ride with her brother-in-law after dark. Her husband sued. She protested. The judge ruled that her dignity was not properly preserved. The brother-in-law was fined. She was divorced. You can see how that door only swings one way. Now imagine this: your husband cheats openly, repeatedly. Perhaps he even brings women into your home under pretense of hiring them as maids or governesses. You know what's happening. Everyone does. You seek advice from a friend or a priest. They say, try to be more agreeable. You protest. They add, don't make this harder on yourself. You can't leave him. You can't shame him. You can't match his behavior. You can only endure it. And yes, sometimes wives did take lovers. Sometimes they snapped. Sometimes they chose freedom over reputation. But when they did, they paid dearly. Women caught in affairs could be institutionalized, disowned, even criminally charged. There's a story in the Illustrated Police News of a woman driven from her home in her nightdress by a husband who found her letter to another man. The neighbors gathered. She was mocked in the street. Police were called to keep her from re-entering her house. The phrase used in court: moral contamination. And here's a cruel little contradiction for your pillow. Tonight, some husbands encouraged affairs, not for forgiveness, but for leverage. A few even hired private detectives to catch wives in compromising situations they'd engineered. Why? So they could divorce them and not the other way around. One man set up his wife with a fake admirer, then paid a constable to discover them at an inn. She never saw it coming. So tonight, as you lie in your bed and feel the quiet rhythm of your own breath, take a moment to appreciate something astonishing: that you can love who you want, that you can say no, that no one can use your desire or your loyalty as legal weapons against you. But for a Victorian wife, a single misstep, real or imagined, meant ruin. His indiscretion was a shrug. Yours, a sentence. There's a lullaby playing somewhere beyond the nursery wall, but it's not for you. You peer through the half-open door, watching the nursemaid cradle your child in a way that no longer belongs to you. Because although you carried this child, suffered for them, bled and broke for them, the law says they are not yours. They're his. Victorian husbands didn't just have legal control over their wives. They also had absolute, unquestioned authority over their children. Full custody, full rights, full power. You're just the vessel, the governess, a sentimental attachment, but not a parent, not in the eyes of the law. This wasn't a hidden clause or a misunderstood policy. It was an openly accepted, codified fact of British legal life. A husband had patria potestas, the paternal power. That ancient Roman concept echoed straight through Georgian wood-paneled courtrooms into the chimneyed parlors of Victorian homes. Let's say your marriage goes sour. He drinks, or cheats, or simply grows tired of your face. You want to leave. But here's the catch. If you walk out, you leave your children behind. Because Victorian law treated a child's legal residence as fixed to the father, not the household. Him. Historians still argue whether this policy was more about preserving patriarchal order or shielding inheritance lines from maternal meddling. But either way, the consequences were brutal. Even if you nursed them, even if you homeschooled them, even if he ignored them completely, they still weren't yours. Take the 1839 case of Caroline Norton, a name that echoes like a broken clock chime in the history of family law. Caroline was a writer, a political thinker, and the estranged wife of George Norton, a man who drank, beat her, and refused to allow her access to her children. When she tried to see them, he had her physically removed. She took her story, public publishing The Separation of Mother and Child by the Laws of Custody, a document so painfully specific, it made Parliament squirm. It worked. Sort of. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839 gave mothers limited access to children under 7 if they were of good moral standing. But let's be real, moral standing was defined by him. If you'd been accused of anything, flirting, reading the wrong books, socializing too freely, your moral fitness could be in doubt, and that meant no visitation. There's your fringe tidbit. Mothers weren't even guaranteed letters to their children. Some courts banned correspondence entirely. One judge called mother-written letters emotional interference. Think about that for a moment. You're not allowed to see your children. You're not allowed to write to them. And if you protest, your distress is cited as proof that you're too unstable to be involved in their lives. Now picture this, your son, aged 4, calls for you in the middle of the night. He has a fever. The nurse calls for your husband, not you. Because legally, you're not his guardian. You're just a woman who lives in the house and sometimes gets weepy over lullabies. And here's the sharper blade: if your husband dies, and he's named someone else guardian in his will, an uncle, a friend, even a clergyman, you still don't get them back. Unless he specifically names you. You are not the default. You are not the fallback. You are not even in the running unless he wrote you in. Imagine burying your husband and watching a solicitor show up the next morning, informing you that your children will now be raised by your brother-in-law in Norfolk. Nothing personal, just legal policy. Do try to be strong. One woman in 1876 lost her children to her late husband's accountant. She had no legal grounds to appeal, and when children were caught in a custody battle, courts rarely listened to their voices, even if they begged. One 10-year-old girl was famously quoted as saying, "I want my mama," she sings to me at night. The court ruled it inadmissible. She was sent to her father in Yorkshire. Her mother died 2 years later from decline. You might be wondering, what about illegitimate children? Those children automatically belonged to the mother. But that wasn't compassion, it was condemnation. Illegitimate children were treated as legal nuisances. Fathers bore no obligation. Mothers bore full blame. It was less a gift than a burden sealed in law. So either you have no rights because you're married, or you have all the rights because the law wants nothing to do with your child. Choose your prison. Now let's return to the drawing room. Your child toddles toward you. You reach out. Your husband frowns just slightly. And you freeze, because a misstep, a tear-raised voice might be enough for him to tell the governess not to let you in the nursery tomorrow, or the day after that, or ever again. He doesn't need a court order. He doesn't need a witness. He just needs to say it's best for the child. And even if he does nothing overtly cruel, if he simply withholds affection or access or decision-making, you're still powerless. If he decides the child will be raised Catholic and you're Anglican tough. If he sends them to boarding school and you object, too bad. If he says no piano lessons, that's the end of the discussion. You can pout. You can sigh. But legally, you're just background music. You know what phrase Victorian law books like to use. The husband is the natural guardian of the child. You know what they never said? The mother is anything. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in and feel the softness of a pillow that belongs to you, know this: once upon a time, a woman could bring life into the world and be told very calmly that she had no claim to it. Because the baby might be in your arms, but the law kept it in his hands. It's a chilly Monday morning, and you're up early, fingers raw from scrubbing lace collars by candlelight. You've spent the last 4 weeks finishing commissions, hand-stitched hems, repaired bodices, even a bespoke waistcoat for a merchant's fussy daughter. The coins jingle lightly in your palm as you imagine a new shawl, a few ribbons, maybe even a meat pie for lunch. But then the door opens, and your husband steps in. He holds out his hand. You freeze. He doesn't ask where the money came from. He doesn't need to. You're his wife. The money is his. Because under Victorian law, anything you earned, no matter how hard, belonged entirely to your husband. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a legal principle baked deep into coverture. Any wages, profits, or fees that a married woman received were automatically transferred to her husband the moment they touched her fingers. She could be a best-selling novelist, a concert pianist, or a midwife delivering babies night after night. It didn't matter. Every coin she made legally flowed into his pocket. You were allowed to work, but not to keep the reward. Historians still argue whether this was meant to preserve patriarchal financial order or simply discourage female independence. But the result was predictable: countless women labored quietly, invisibly, and without profit. And those who resisted risked losing even more. Take, for instance, the case of Isabella Beeton. Yes, that Mrs. Beeton, the domestic goddess of Victorian kitchens. Her name graced one of the most famous household manuals of the century, the Book of Household Management. But the earnings collected by her husband, Samuel. She did the labor. He made the deals. He controlled the rights. And when she died at 28, her legacy went straight into his estate. Imagine that: a national household icon, and legally still just an unpaid ghostwriter in her own home. Now let's say you run a shop, a little hat-making stall. You wake before dawn, measure and cut deal with fussy customers, manage inventory, keep books. The stall bears your name, but the profits are deposited in your husband's bank account. You can't open your own without his consent. And if you hide a few shillings for yourself, that's fraud. Against your own marriage. Here's your fringe tidbit. Victorian courts saw several cases where husbands sued their wives for misappropriating their own earnings. One husband filed a claim against his wife for keeping tips from her sewing clients in a locked tea tin. The court found in his favor. She was ordered to surrender all funds improperly withheld. You can't make this up. The law extended this control to intellectual property as well. If you wrote a novel, painted a portrait, or invented something, guess who owned the rights? Your husband. In fact, many women published under male names, not just for respectability, but so they could secretly keep the profits without legal suspicion. The Bronte sisters used pseudonyms partly for this reason. It wasn't just artistic, it was strategic survival. Even when women managed to secure income on the side, it could be turned against them. If a wife was suspected of hiding money, the husband could argue in court that she was engaging in financial deceit and use that as grounds for divorce or confinement. One woman was institutionalized in 1872 for erratic behavior that turned out to be simply managing a secret ledger of her dressmaking clients. Her crime, fiscal independence. And before you ask, no, there were no real loopholes. Even women who inherited money from their family faced this hurdle. Unless their father or benefactor specifically created a trust, excluding the husband's access, the money was absorbed. In many cases, these inheritances vanished within a year. A gambling debt here, a failed railway venture there. The husband could legally spend it all, and the wife had no grounds to stop him. Let's picture a slightly wealthier scenario. You're an actress, a minor celebrity. You earn applause roses and 5 guineas a week, but you're married. And your husband, perhaps an aspiring poet, sits backstage every night, waiting to collect your wages. Sometimes he drinks them. Sometimes he invests them. But they're never yours. You ask for a new corset. He says no. He pockets your coin, then tells the landlady you are the spendthrift. Want to save secretly? You can try. Some women did. There's record of pin money tins, hidden in chimneys, hollow books, false-bottomed drawers. One widow's estate revealed a secret floorboard stash of 48 stodlers in coins, each earned in secret penny by penny. She had never spent a cent of it. She just wanted to own something. You know what makes this even more absurd? If your husband got into debt, your earnings were fair game. Creditors could seize household income, your income, to pay his bills. And if they took everything, there were no exemptions for your tools, your fabrics, your shop materials. Those belonged to him by extension. So they were all fair pickings. And let's not forget about taxes. In some cities, women who ran market stalls or shops had to pay business taxes, yet couldn't legally collect or control the revenue. Talk about insult layered over injury. The absurdity runs even deeper. Picture a couple separating, not divorcing, just living apart. You start working to support yourself. He returns suddenly, demands the money. You object. He sues, and he wins because you're still married. Because you made that money while wearing his surname. There's one chilling courtroom quote from 1865 that sums it up too well. A married woman may possess skill, patience, and ingenuity, but these assets, once exercised, become the profit of her husband by law and by God. And you might be thinking, surely this ended eventually. Yes, but not soon. The first real break didn't come until 1870 with the Married Women's Property Act. Even then, it only allowed women to retain earnings after marriage, not what they brought into it. And enforcement weak. Loopholes plentiful. The real change that didn't arrive until 1882. And even then, many women found their money disappearing through joint accounts controlled by the same old patriarchal rules. So tonight, as you lie in your warm private bed, perhaps with a bank account, in your own name, perhaps with a job that pays you, directly take a quiet breath. Because for the Victorian wife, wealth didn't mean power. Success didn't mean independence. And labor, no matter how brilliant, meant nothing unless he allowed it to mean something. You could sew a fortune into every hem, but the law still stitched his name onto your coin. You stare at the envelope again. It's thin, crisp, with your name inked in a practiced hand. But you already know what's inside. The solicitor had warned you. You open it anyway. Your husband wants a separation. You blink once, twice. Not because it's a surprise, but because you already know what comes next. The ruin. In Victorian England, leaving your husband for any reason meant inviting a storm of financial, social, and legal devastation. There was no mutual breakup, no conscious uncoupling. Divorce wasn't just rare, it was nearly impossible. And for women, it was a public, humiliating, uphill battle that usually ended with nothing. No home, no children, no income, no name. Let's rewind a bit to how the law actually worked. Before 1857, divorce in England could only be granted by a private act of Parliament, meaning it was expensive, time-consuming, and entirely inaccessible to the average couple. The price, roughly $1,000, a fortune. You'd need money, lawyers, political allies, and a scandal juicy enough to sell in Parliament's gossip circles. So for most women, divorce didn't exist. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 finally shifted divorce to a civil process. Sounds great, right? Not so fast. The act was built on a bedrock of inequality. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone. But a wife, she had to prove adultery plus additional aggravating factors: cruelty, incest, desertion, or bestiality. Yes, that's listed. If she couldn't stack her accusations, case dismissed. Historians still argue whether this imbalance was a nod to male economic dependence or simply a convenient way to punish female sexuality, but either way, it was the law. Let's walk through a scenario. Your husband is unfaithful, brazenly, perhaps even publicly. You gather evidence, write letters, consult a lawyer. He scoffs. You file a petition. The judge says, "Where's the cruelty?" You tell him about the shouting, the coldness, the silence. He shrugs. Not cruel enough. The case is thrown out. He returns home smug, and you're now the villain because you dared to try. Fringe, tidbit. In 1861, a woman's case was thrown out because her husband's mistress was only a servant and not a lady of ill repute. His adultery wasn't significant enough. Let that sink in. If you did manage to get a divorce, what came next was no victory parade. First, you lost your reputation. Newspapers printed the details. Divorce court was public on purpose. The Victorian idea was that transparency discouraged immorality. What it really did was make women into public morality plays. Your name, your address, even quotes from your letters were published. Everyone saw them. Everyone read them. Even your grocer. One poor woman, Louisa Hamley, was described in the Times as a woman of overwrought sentimentality. That was their polite way of saying she cried in court. Second, you lost your money. Unless you had a private trust, extremely rare, or came from a rich family willing to fight for you, your finances vanished with the marriage. Your husband kept whatever you brought in, and whatever was built while you were his wife. You walked out with maybe a bonnet and a pair of gloves. And third, most painful of all, you likely lost your children. Because remember, child custody belonged to the father. Even if you were divorcing him, he could claim you were unstable, immoral, or over-emotional. The bar wasn't high. You just had to seem a bit too passionate, maybe a bit too clever. And what if you didn't divorce, but he left you? That didn't make things better. In fact, it made things worse. Legally, you were still his wife, but now abandoned without support and still without rights. If he refused to pay maintenance, you had limited recourse. The magistrate might order him to send a few shillings. If he disappeared to Scotland or abroad, you starved. There's a documented case of a woman in 1874 whose husband abandoned her in Liverpool and moved to Canada. She was left with 3 children and no income. She worked scrubbing stairs and sewing shirts at night. The court ordered maintenance. He ignored it. No one enforced it. She died in a workhouse. Want to hear something especially cruel? If you had an affair even after he left you, he could sue you and win, because you were still married. Your adultery, even in absence, was a legal offense. And your partner, he could be charged with enticing a wife from her husband, fined, even jailed. But your husband could abandon you with impunity. And if you returned to him, hoping to reconcile, you weren't safe. A husband could accept you back then, turn around, and use your past against you later. Courts allowed it. A man in 1866 reconciled with his wife for 3 years, then used an earlier affair to claim custody of their children and push her into a private asylum. Imagine forgiving someone, living with them again, and being punished after. Here's another layer: some women never even wanted divorce. They just wanted protection. But the only legal option for separation, what was called a judicial separation, still required evidence of cruelty or adultery. And it carried nearly the same penalties: public shame, child loss, financial instability. So most women stayed, quietly, carefully, hoping things would improve, or simply stop getting worse. But some rebelled. They fled, disguised themselves, sailed to distant towns, changed their names. You'll hear more about those escapees later. For now, just imagine what kind of desperation it takes to leave behind everything: friends, family, children, not for freedom, but for a sliver of peace. Tonight, as you nestle into the softness of your bed, consider this. In Victorian England, ending a bad marriage wasn't the start of a better life. It was the start of your punishment. You weren't escaping. You were stepping off a cliff. The bookshelf is half empty now. You hadn't noticed at first, just a missing pamphlet here, a vanished novel there. But this morning, as you reach for your favorite volume of Byron, it's gone. So is Mary Wollstonecraft. So is anything with too many opinions or too much imagination. You ask your husband, voice casual, "Where are my books?" He doesn't look up. They weren't suitable, he says, and keeps reading the newspaper. Welcome to another fine point of Victorian marriage: your education, your mind, your curiosity, all legally within his jurisdiction. Because under the cultural and legal norms of the era, your husband could deny you access to books. He could prohibit your reading. He could withhold educational materials. And no law, none at all, protected your right to learn. The logic was simple and patriarchal. As his wife, you were under his moral and intellectual guidance. He, being the head of the household, had not just a right, but a duty to regulate what you read, what you studied, and what ideas you entertained. You might wonder, could he really legally forbid you to read? Historians still argue whether this was a matter of enforceable law or just an extension of coverture's invisible boundaries. But either way, the outcome was consistent. Women's intellectual lives were not their own. And if a husband decided your reading was inappropriate, that was final. Now imagine you're a literate, curious woman. You want to read about anatomy or philosophy or the political reforms stirring in Parliament. Your husband says no, that's it, you're done. Try to borrow books in secret and you're being deceitful. Try to hide pamphlets under the mattress and you're being suspicious. Protest and you might be called hysterical. And we all remember what they do to hysterical wives. Here's a fringe tidbit. One well-documented case from 1868 involved a husband who petitioned a local magistrate to intervene because his wife was unsettled by reading Jane Eyre. The novel, he claimed, inflamed her sense of independence and made her resistant to routine. The court declined to intervene directly, but praised him for protecting the household's harmony. Jane Eyre, folks. Too radical. And the limits didn't stop at fiction. Scientific journals, dangerous. Religious tracts from the wrong denomination, subversive. Feminist essays, practically criminal. One wife who attempted to subscribe to the Englishwoman's Review had the delivery canceled by her husband, who sent a letter to the editor insisting that the publication corrupted otherwise manageable minds. There's a term for this now, intellectual gatekeeping. But back then, it was just marriage. Even girls' education was carefully filtered to prepare them for future obedience. If you were lucky enough to attend a school, you'd be taught sewing French phrases, piano, and etiquette. Literature, only the soft stuff. No Voltaire, no Darwin, no radical poets. History, carefully selected stories about noble wives and brave men. Science, possibly, if it was framed as homemaking efficiency. But critical thinking, questioning the church, doubting your husband's decisions, not part of the curriculum. Now picture yourself again. You walk into your own parlor and find your husband burning a stack of papers in the fireplace. They're letters you'd saved, maybe journals, maybe articles clipped from The Spectator. You gasp. He turns to you with mild surprise and says, "You don't need those." And legally, he's not wrong. Under coverture, your possessions, including your books, your notebooks, your diaries, were his. If he thought something was unsuitable, he could destroy it without a second thought. Let's talk about private libraries. In wealthier households, husbands often prided themselves on maintaining large libraries. But access was tiered. Visitors could peruse the collection. Male relatives could borrow titles. Wives, sometimes they were permitted to read from a small feminine shelf books pre-approved for their emotional gentleness and moral utility. Think conduct books and chastity tales. Nothing unsettling. One notorious shelf staple, The Wife's Manual by Mrs. Polk Colquhoun, a book that literally instructed women to consume only literature that reflects the Lord's design for gentle obedience. It was published in 17 editions. Even writing your own words could be restricted. Some husbands forbade their wives to keep diaries or write letters. Why? Because private writing meant private thought, and private thought might lead to questions, and questions led to defiance. Better to nip it early. In one household journal from 1873, a husband documented removing the temptation to excessive imagination by locking his wife's writing desk. She had been composing poetry. Nothing published, just pages. He burned them all. Let that settle. And it's not just what you read, it's how you read. One judge's commentary from 1855 stated, "A wife who reads in solitude may foster a secret world outside her marriage, and this is not to be encouraged." In solitude. Think about that. It wasn't even the material that worried them. It was the space books created inside your mind. This isn't just censorship. It's mental claustrophobia. And the wider world agreed. Popular media warned husbands about intellectual wives. Editorials mocked women who quoted Rousseau at dinner or corrected their husbands' grammar. Cartoons showed wives dragging their husbands to feminist lectures where they fell asleep next to piles of books titled, "Why Men Are Wrong." Humorous, until it wasn't. Because women who pushed too far were sometimes punished. Not just with lectures, but with seclusion, with rest cures, with sudden diagnoses of moral insanity, a term applied to wives who read too much, talked too much, or heaven forbid, wrote letters to editors. The famous case of Constance Newberry locked away for epistolary addiction is still studied. She'd written over 50 political letters in 1 year. Her husband claimed she had abandoned her feminine role. The asylum took her. And let's not forget the practical side. If you weren't allowed to read, how could you understand your legal standing or your rights or your options? Simple answer, you couldn't. And that's how the system liked it. So tonight, as you turn the pages of a book of your own choosing, maybe fiction, maybe theory, maybe something bold and biting, let it be a quiet act of rebellion on behalf of every Victorian wife who stared longingly at a locked bookcase, wondering what words were kept from her. Because in a world where knowledge was power, they made sure the keys stayed in his hands. You sit perfectly still, elbows off the table, chin lifted the correct half-inch, listening to your husband speak. He's explaining something about banking slowly, as though to a child. You know the topic. You've read about it, but you don't interrupt. You've learned better. You smile and nod and offer a soft, "How clever you are, darling." Because even speaking too much, especially if you know what you're talking about, can be seen as a challenge. And in your house, challenges are not permitted. It's a quiet tyranny, but tonight it's going to get louder. Because now you'd like to visit your sister. Just for an afternoon. No trouble. But your husband says no, not today. You press gently. Why not? He sighs, annoyed. Because I said so. End of discussion. You don't go. Because in Victorian England, your husband had the legal authority to restrict your movements, dictate your social life, and deny you permission to leave the house for any reason at all, and there was nothing you could do about it. The same logic that let him confine you indoors, remember, extended out into the social realm. You needed his approval to visit friends, attend church, travel to the market, or even take your child to the doctor. If he said no, it wasn't just a disagreement. It was the law backing his domestic jurisdiction. Historians still argue whether this power came from the legal structures of coverture or was more deeply embedded in the customs of patriarchal oversight, but in practice it didn't matter. You couldn't socialize without permission, and if you tried, you might be labeled unruly or worse, disobedient. And disobedient wives were often punished with isolation or accusations of hysteria. Let's talk about the idea of a license to leave. In wealthier homes, it was sometimes a literal note handwritten by the husband and signed. Without it, servants or coachmen wouldn't take you anywhere. And yes, that includes simply going to the village bakery or walking in the park. If you were middle or lower class, you didn't get a written note, but the expectation remained, don't go anywhere without his say-so. And if someone saw you out unaccompanied, they might assume something was wrong with the marriage, or worse, with you. There's a fringe case from 1871 in which a woman was denied entry to a church garden because she wasn't properly escorted. She was 35, married, and just wanted to sit under a tree and read. The groundskeeper said, "Where's your man then?" When she told her husband later, he laughed, and then forbade her from returning, citing public embarrassment. You think perhaps you could go without asking. Just slip out. But then what? If he finds out, and he will, he could accuse you of impropriety. He might tell the neighbors you're unstable. He might say you're trying to seduce someone. He might take the keys, lock the windows, remove the servants, and still the law would do nothing. Because what happens between a man and his wife inside the home, that's private, off limits, not the business of the courts, even when it very much should be. Now imagine you've been invited to tea. Nothing scandalous, just a quiet gathering with 2 other women and a curate's wife. You get your hat, you smooth your skirt, and then your husband says, "I don't think you need to go." Not angrily, just plainly. And that's enough. The bonnet goes back on the hook. The tea grows cold. You sit by the window with your embroidery, trying not to feel like a bird with clipped wings. This didn't just affect your social life, it affected your entire perception of reality. You stop asking. You stop planning. You begin to tell yourself you didn't want to go anyway. You lose the names of people you used to visit. You forget the smell of their homes, the rhythm of their voices. You become a ghost with good posture. Here's an unsettling anecdote. In one home journal from 1866, a woman wrote of requesting to attend her cousin's wedding. Her husband refused. She asked again, gently. He called her a nag. She stayed home. Later, she wrote in her diary, "I wonder if I am now a thing that simply waits to be told what matters." That line was circled in red pencil, likely by a later reader. And here's your open insult: even when women were allowed out, they were often required to follow strict behavioral codes. Speak softly. Don't laugh loudly. Don't contradict anyone. Don't stay too long. If your behavior in public reflected poorly on your husband, he could cite it as grounds for confinement, or even seek a legal separation on the grounds of your scandalous reputation. Let's pause on that. If you embarrassed him in public, he might legally restrict you in private. That's not a partnership. That's a leash. Some women fought back, of course. They found loopholes. Women's societies and charitable groups sometimes acted as shields, offering structured, respectable reasons for women to leave the house. Bible studies became political strategy groups. Quilting circles became message networks. One such group in 1878 helped 5 women coordinated outing excuses so they could attend a suffrage rally dressed as housemaids. But the risk was always there. Because your husband could walk into any room, declare your behavior disrespectful, and the world would nod along. You weren't disrespected, you were being corrected. There's one especially cruel variation worth noting: the non-response strategy. Some husbands didn't outright forbid social visits. They just refused to acknowledge them. If you asked, they'd change the subject, or say, "We'll see," or "I don't care what you do." But if you went out and something went wrong, a neighbor's disapproving glance, a broken carriage wheel, a lost glove, he'd say, "Well, that's what happens when you stop listening." The message was clear: even when you had freedom, you'd be punished for using it. So tonight, as you walk freely through your space, visiting friends, calling loved ones, or stepping outside without a second thought, know this: in Victorian England, your social life was not your own. Your footsteps belonged to your husband. Your freedom came second to his opinion, and your world ended at the edge of his patience. Word count 1,287. Awaiting continue. Ban John Noy. Continue. Chat GPT John Noy. Section 12. There's a knock at the door. Not a sharp rap, more of a hesitant tap, as if the person on the other side isn't sure whether they're delivering a message or a warning. You answer, apron still on flour on your hands. It's a constable cap in hand. He says your husband has filed a complaint. Something about your tone, madam. About your conduct in public. You blink, confused. Then he says the words you never thought you'd hear spoken aloud, not here, not about you. You may be called to court, but understand your testimony won't count for much. Because in Victorian England, a wife's word, especially against her husband, was legally diminished. It wasn't just ignored, it was inadmissible. You were not a reliable witness, not if the subject was your marriage, not if the defendant was your husband, not even in many cases if the crime was committed against you. It's easy to forget now in a world where testifying is a right that not so long ago it was a privilege, one not extended to married women. Under common law, a wife couldn't testify against her husband in criminal cases. Why? Because of coverture again, that ever-hungry beast. Since you were one legal entity, the logic went you couldn't testify against yourself. and your husband was yourself. Neat trick, right? But that trick had teeth. It meant that even if you saw him commit a crime, embezzlement, bribery, assault, you couldn't say a word in court. And if the crime was against you, the burden of proof had to come from someone else. Your bruises weren't enough. Your screams weren't enough. Your diary wasn't enough. Because you weren't just biased, you were legally disqualified. Historians still argue whether this was about protecting marital harmony or preserving patriarchal control in public courts. But whatever the theory, the reality was, crushing your voice was decorative, not admissible. Take a documented 1864 case in Sussex. A woman named Margaret Lawson was beaten by her husband in front of two servants. He was arrested. In court, she wasn't allowed to speak, not even when the judge asked who had fetched the doctor. The servants testified. She sat silently watching her own story unfold without her. Here's your fringe tidbit. Even in civil suits like property disputes, some judges would disregard a wife's statement as untrustworthy if it contradicted her husband's. One even said aloud, a wife's account, though vivid, lacks impartial structure. Vivid. He meant emotional. He meant unreliable. He meant sit down. Now imagine your husband accuses you of something, say theft, or adultery, or disrespect. He takes you to court or threatens to. You want to defend yourself, but your testimony can be called biased, even when it's the only version of the truth. You cry, you explain, you plead, and the court sees a woman who's too emotional to be factual. He speaks, calmly, rationally, and the court nods. Let's be clear, this wasn't just about you being a woman. It was about being his woman. A single woman could testify. A widow could testify. But a wife, she was too bound to her husband's interest. The assumption was that you'd either protect him too fiercely or betray him out of bitterness. Either way, your word was tainted. It gets darker. In some criminal cases, you could be forced to testify for him. Imagine your husband is on trial for theft. You know he's guilty. But the prosecution calls you as a character witness. You're not allowed to decline. You're required to speak on his behalf. And if you lie to protect him, that's perjury. If you tell the truth, that's betrayal and grounds for separation, child loss, and social destruction. You're trapped between loyalty and survival. Again. And don't even think about bringing a charge of your own. If he beats you, for instance, and you go to court, your statement isn't enough. You need outside witnesses, often male, often reluctant to corroborate. Without them, the case withers. And if he walks free, he returns home with a silent legal message tucked into his waistcoat pocket. She doesn't matter. Now let's zoom in. It's a quiet night. You've been writing in your diary. Nothing scandalous, just thoughts, observations. You tuck it away in your desk. The next morning, he finds it. He flips through the pages, finds an entry about how you no longer love him, about how you dread his footsteps on the stairs. He slams the book closed. He calls you a traitor, maybe a whore, maybe worse. You try to explain those were your words written in private. He says no, those are accusations. He files for divorce. Your own words written when you had no other outlet are read aloud in court as evidence against you. But when you try to speak, to explain, to provide context, you're cut off. You are, after all, a wife. Your truth is tainted. It happened. More than once. There's a courtroom record from 1872 where a woman was not allowed to respond to her husband's accusations because the judge ruled that a wife's rebuttal in such cases is more likely to inflame than clarify. So much for your day in court. Some women tried other paths. Anonymous letters to newspapers, whispered conversations with sympathetic lawyers. carefully phrased complaints through male relatives. But nothing replaced the power of being able to say in your own voice, "That is a lie. This is what happened," and have the law listen. You might think surely this changed with time. It did, but not as fast as you'd hope. The legal right for wives to testify against their husbands didn't become solidly enshrined until the late 19th century, and even then, it was riddled with exceptions. If the crime was deemed domestic, courts often still refused to let wives speak, because domestic meant private, and private meant untouchable, invisible justice, sealed in silence. So tonight, as you lie back and listen to the quiet hum of the world around you, think about your voice, about the small, astonishing privilege of being able to speak, to be believed, to challenge, to bear witness. And know that not so long ago, a wife could watch her entire life unravel in court, without being allowed to say a single word in her defense. Because in the eyes of Victorian law, a husband's voice was law, and a wife's voice, just noise. The maid brings in your morning tea as usual. Only today there's something different on the tray, a folded slip of blue paper. The handwriting is careful, clean, unmistakably not yours. It's a note from your husband. Not a love letter, not a breakfast request. It reads, "You are not to wear that green dress again." You pause, cup in hand, halfway to your lips. The green dress, the one with the fine silk trim and the daring but hardly scandalous neckline. You wore it once to a dinner party, and he didn't speak to you for 2 days afterward. Now he's forbidden it, and the worst part, he can. In Victorian England, your husband didn't just control your money, your voice, or your movements. He controlled your wardrobe. What you wore, how you wore it, where and when, and even why, it was all subject to his approval. You were not a mannequin of your own design. You were a walking reflection of his taste, his politics, his status, and the law had no objection to that. Historians still argue whether wardrobe control stemmed more from legal precedent or just the deeply gendered norms of public respectability. But in practice, the impact was the same. Your dress was his canvas. Your appearance was not personal. It was property. Let's say you're partial to a particular bonnet. It's wide-brimmed, a bit fashion-forward with little velvet bows. He hates it, thinks it makes you look too forward. You wear it anyway, just once more. That night at dinner, the silence wraps around you like a second corset. The next morning, the bonnet is missing. You ask the maid. She shrugs. You ask again. She whispers that the master took it and disposed of it. You never see it again. Fringe tidbit. There were tailors in London, quiet, discreet tailors who kept secret ledgers for women buying garments without their husband's knowledge. These women came in veiled, used aliases and paid in cash from hidden pin money tins. One such shop was raided in 1879 when a husband discovered a crimson evening gown he'd not authorized. He called it a symptom of marital deviation. And yes, the wife was blamed. You might think, but surely she could just choose more modest clothing, more traditional things. But even modesty wasn't a shield, because often the issue wasn't the clothing itself, but the autonomy it represented. A dress you picked out without his input, a color he found unbecoming, a fabric too rich, too poor, too French, too old-fashioned. The issue was control, not aesthetics. Take the case of Lydia Emsworth, a merchant's wife from Manchester. She wore a black gown with gold stitching to a cousin's wedding. Her husband hadn't seen it before. When she returned home, he accused her of trying to attract scandal. He tore the dress in half. She later recounted in a letter that she slept in her petticoat that night, her wardrobe locked in his study. And remember, if he bought your clothes, he owned them outright. If you bought them, they still belonged to him by law. He could sell them, donate them, cut them into rags. Your corsets, your gowns, your gloves, all technically his. Now imagine you want to change your look. Nothing outrageous, just a shorter hemline for comfort or a brighter color to feel alive. He says no. You do it anyway. He sends you back to the dressmaker for alterations. Or worse, he stops giving you money for new dresses altogether. And suddenly you realize every stitch of fabric on your body is a negotiation. Let's step sideways for a moment and talk about uniforms. Some husbands demanded their wives only wear black or gray or dull blue. Some had strict rules about what to wear on Sundays, what to wear around the house, and what to wear to bed. There were documented cases of husbands who destroyed unflattering dresses and mandated that their wives be seen only in specific silhouettes. To maintain dignity, they'd say. Your body wasn't even yours. It was a display case. And the clothing, just the drapery. One deeply unsettling quote from an etiquette manual published in 1860 reads, "The modest wife does not adorn herself for the eyes of the world, but dresses as her husband sees fit, lest she give the impression of self-pride." Let's unpack that. You don't dress for comfort, or function, or expression. You dress for your husband's sense of how you should be seen, and if he decides that's dowdy, shapeless, and voiceless, then so be it. Now picture yourself visiting a seamstress. You explain what you want. She nods cautiously, then asks, "Does the master approve of this?" If you say yes, she'll go ahead. If you say no, she hesitates. Because if he finds out, he might not just refuse to pay. He might ruin her reputation, or accuse her of corrupting you. And once again, your will is secondhand, borrowed, conditional. This control extended to grooming as well. Hairstyles, jewelry, even shoes. There's an 1875 case in which a husband forbade his wife from wearing boots with heels, claiming they made her look vain. She continued to wear them. One day they were gone. The next time she wore heels, they were slashed with a razor. The damage was called corrective. And don't imagine the world outside your home will intervene. If anything, they'll back him up. Newspapers often published morality columns praising wives who dressed in accordance with their husbands' tastes. One column in the Ladies' Companion celebrated a wife who wore the same brown shawl for 6 years because her husband admired its modest humility. The woman in question, quietly miserable according to her daughter's memoirs. Let's go even further. Say your husband wants you to wear something you despise. A ruffled collar that chafes your skin. A bonnet that pinches. A color that makes you feel invisible. He insists. You wear it. Because refusing would be defiant, and defiance in a Victorian wife was treated less like a personality trait and more like a symptom to be corrected. Even fashion magazines joined in. Articles often featured wife wardrobes, layouts of outfits carefully curated not by trend, but by domestic harmony. Fashion wasn't for expression, it was for obedience. So tonight, as you pull on your favorite pajamas, cotton soft, perfectly, you think about what it would mean to have that choice taken from you. To open a closet and see not your taste but his. To wear someone else's expectations every day, every hour. Because in Victorian England, you wore what he allowed. You appeared as he dictated, and every button you fastened was stitched with his permission. Word count 1289. Awaiting continue Ban Jun Noi continue Chat GPT Jun Noi. Section 14. It's a mild spring afternoon, and the kettle whistles low on the stove. You glance at the clock, it's nearly 4, just enough time to walk to the bakery and stop by the seamstress before supper. You tie your bonnet, reach for the door, and your husband steps in front of it. Where are you going? You tell him. He smiles thinly. No, not today. You wait for a reason, a justification. But that's it. Not today. And the door stays closed. Because in Victorian England, even your socializing was subject to your husband's permission. That casual tea with a friend, the quiet visit to your sister, the simple act of leaving the house to spend time with someone other than him, it was not your right. It was a privilege granted or revoked at will. This wasn't a quirk of etiquette. It was part of the larger system of marital control. Coverture again lays the groundwork. You are not your own person. Therefore, your movements, associations, and social habits are his concern. And the social world, neighbors, servants, clergy, backs it up. Historians still argue whether this was an evolution of feudal household order or a conscious strategy of isolation. But the effect is undeniable. Victorian women lived under surveillance even when no one was watching. Let's walk through the math. You're allowed perhaps 1 or 2 social calls per week, pre-approved, predictably tame. You might go to church or visit a cousin or join a sewing circle, but always with clear boundaries, no unscheduled detours, no lingering, no sudden invitations. And if you accept an invitation without consulting him, you're seen as impulsive, inconsiderate, possibly disrespectful. Even that soft sin presumption was enough to spark cold silences or angry lectures. A fringe tidbit to curl your toes tonight: in one upper-middle-class home in 1870, a husband kept a literal outing log for his wife. Each visit was logged, time-stamped, and reviewed. Once she returned 10 minutes late. The next day, the seamstress she visited received a warning letter. "You are not to delay my wife's returns. This is a household matter." It was signed in ink. Not red, but close. Now imagine this scenario. You hear that an old friend, someone dear to you, is visiting town for a single day. You want to see her. You ask your husband, heart cautiously hopeful. He says no. Doesn't offer a reason, doesn't need to. "She's not the right sort of woman," he says vaguely. You try to argue. He frowns. You say nothing else. The visit never happens. Later, when your friend writes, confused, hurt, your reply is careful. You thank her for understanding. You lie. Because to say the truth, "I wasn't allowed," would embarrass him. And in this society, his embarrassment is more dangerous than your heartbreak. Even close family visits weren't guaranteed. If your sister was outspoken, or your mother too opinionated, or your aunt, a widow who dared to remarry your husband, might prohibit contact. And legally, that was fine. One woman's diary from 1862 records her begging to attend her brother's funeral. Her husband refused. She stayed home staring out the window. "I wore my mourning gloves and cried where he couldn't see. And if you defied him, well." There were consequences. Some husbands withdrew money. Others locked doors. Still others quietly blacklisted their wives from social circles by spreading word that they were unsteady or emotionally erratic. That kind of whisper killed invitations faster than any letter ever could. You want an example? In one 1881 case, a woman named Julia was found attending a poetry reading without her husband's blessing. It wasn't scandalous. No affair, no impropriety, just poetry. When he found out, he withdrew her allowance, took her name off the household accounts, and barred the maid from giving her carriage access. She was left to write letters by candlelight, begging friends for stamps. And society did not rally to her side, because independence, even in the form of mild companionship, was seen as dangerous, disruptive, contagious. Even the activities you were permitted to do came with rules. If you visited someone too frequently, you were suspicious. If you laughed too loud, you were vulgar. If you walked home alone, even just a few blocks, you were reckless. Every decision was scrutinized through the lens of, how does this reflect on your husband? Because make no mistake, it wasn't really about you. It was about him. You were an extension of his reputation, his household brand. If you behaved too boldly, he looked like a weak man. And weak men didn't command respect. So you became the silent mirror he polished every morning with rules and restrictions. Let's shift gears for a moment. Say you receive an invitation to join a charitable society, perfectly respectable, lady-led, focused on aiding orphaned children. You're thrilled. You've always wanted to be useful. You show your husband the letter. He glances at it once and says, "No. I think you're too emotional for causes." You never join. And the next time you feel restless, you go upstairs, open the wardrobe, and rearrange your gloves by color. Because that, at least, no one has forbidden yet. Some women found workarounds. Chaperones, double invitations, falsified errands. One clever woman in 1877 kept a rotating schedule of shopping visits, which were actually secret salons in her cousin's parlor. They discussed literature, reform, law, carefully, quietly, always with one eye on the clock. It worked for almost a year. Then a neighbor mentioned it to her husband. The meetings stopped. The punishment he had, the locks changed. She was allowed out only with a footman in tow, for her protection. So tonight, as you walk through your neighborhood, maybe text a friend last minute, maybe sit for coffee unannounced, feel the subtle, luxurious thrill of casual freedom. That you can say, "I'm going out," and no one has the right to ask who gave you permission. Because for the Victorian wife, friendship was filtered through her husband's mood. Every cup of tea required clearance, and every hello was a negotiation. The room is silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the rustle of your husband's newspaper. You speak softly, politely, asking for help. There's been a mistake with the grocer. He grunts. You try again, a little firmer. He lowers the paper eyes, cold. "Mind your tone," he says. A wife should know her place. You flinch not because of his words, but because you know what might follow. You've seen it before. The clenching of his fists, the way he stands a little too fast, the way the air tightens just before his hand strikes. And if it does, if he hits you, there is nothing you can do. Because in Victorian England, you cannot sue your husband, not for assault, not for cruelty, not even for bodily harm. But he can sue you for things as petty as defamation, disobedience, or dishonoring his name. The legal imbalance is not metaphorical. It's carved in stone. Under coverture, you and your husband are legally one person, and he's the person. That means you can't enter a contract without his name. You can't own property. And you certainly can't bring a lawsuit against your legal guardian. It's a bit like trying to file a lawsuit against your own shadow. Historians still argue whether this was more about upholding marriage as a sacred, untouchable institution, or about preserving men's control in private spaces. But the effect was chillingly consistent. If he hurt you, you endured it. If he damaged your body, your reputation, your future, you accepted it. You had no recourse in the eyes of the law. Let's say he strikes you, leaves bruises. You go to the magistrate. He listens, maybe sympathetically, but then explains gently that his hands are tied. It's a domestic matter, he says, not for public inquiry, and you go home humiliated and alone. Now picture the reverse. Your husband claims you insulted him in front of a guest. Perhaps you called him lazy, or corrected his Latin, or made a joke too pointed. He files a petition for judicial separation on the grounds of cruelty or misconduct. Yes, he says you are cruel. He says your voice is shrill, your manner disrespectful, your attitude unbecoming of a proper wife. And the courts will hear that case. Because while you cannot sue him, he can accuse you of failing in your wifely duties. And in Victorian legal logic, duties include more than housekeeping. They include emotional obedience, deference, silence. If you break those rules, he can claim his marriage has been injured and ask for separation or even institutionalization. Let's not sugarcoat this. A husband could hurt you physically and no one would step in. But if you hurt his pride, you could lose everything. There's a fringe tidbit from 1869 in which a man sued his wife's family, her brothers, for encouraging her to question his authority. He won. The court ruled that their uninvited intrusion into a lawful marriage undermined his ability to govern his household. The wife never permitted to return to her brother's home again. It wasn't just about physical violence. It was about legal immunity. There was a saying among court clerks: "A wife's complaints are like the wind felt but not heard. Cold comfort if you were nursing a black eye or wearing long sleeves in July." Let's say you tried to be clever. You seek help from your parish vicar. Maybe he listens, maybe he nods. But his advice will almost always end with, "Be patient. Be quiet. Try not to provoke him." If he's more progressive, he might recommend a cooling off period. But a priest cannot grant you safety, and a bruised cheek does not qualify as just cause for intervention. If you press too hard, too loudly, that's when things turn worse. Because now you're not just suffering, you're being difficult. And once the label difficult wife lands on you, everything else begins to unravel. You might find your access to money limited, your visitors refused, your letters opened and read. He might accuse you of madness. And that accusation, as we've already seen, can become a one-way ticket to the asylum. It didn't take much. One outburst, one letter, one friend who listened too sympathetically. And if you dared to strike him back even once, well, that was criminal assault. There's a documented case from 1880. A woman named Agnes hit her husband in the face with a candlestick after he pinned her to the floor during an argument. She was arrested. He testified that she was prone to violent temperaments. Her bruises were never examined. The magistrate ruled her unfit for household peace. She spent 8 months in Holloway prison. He remarried within the year. And yes, the new wife was 18. Now let's flip the scene. Say he commits fraud, uses your name to secure a loan, sells your inherited furniture, forges your signature on a letter. You discover it. You gather the documents. You go to a lawyer. He explains gently that you can't press charges. "You're married, madam," he says, as if that should clarify everything. And it does. You are not you, you are his. He can act in your name, claim your possessions, and use your identity with impunity. And if you object, well, he might just claim you're confused, or worse, irrational. And that's the trap. Because the law doesn't just fail to protect you, it actively arms your oppressor. It hands him the tools of surveillance, censorship, violence, and isolation. It ties your hands and then punishes you for not fighting back. There were women who tried to push through, who gathered evidence, wrote to newspapers, begged for reform. Some managed to shame the system, but most, they learned to walk quietly, to placate, to endure. So tonight, as you rest in a world that, however imperfect, lets you file a report, tell your story, be heard in your own words. Take a moment to imagine what it was like when even the law said, "You don't count." Because in the Victorian marriage contract, he had the right to punish. You had the duty to suffer. And if you objected, you had no voice. Just silence. And maybe long sleeves. There's something intimate about a letter. The scratch of ink. The slight weight of the envelope. A curl of scent, lavender or dust, or your own anxiety. You pour yourself into the lines. A confession to your sister. A joke for a friend. A cry for help folded neatly and sealed. You place the letter in the post bag, but it never arrives. Because in Victorian England, your husband has the legal right to intercept, open, and read your mail, both incoming and outgoing. Every envelope addressed to you, every folded page you write, every word whispered in ink was by default his business. Privacy was a fantasy. The postal system for wives was a mirror house of censorship. This wasn't simply a marital quirk. It was part of a broader legal framework that gave husbands control over their wives' communications. Under coverture, you had no independent legal identity. Therefore, your correspondence, like your property and your wages, belonged to him. And Victorian society didn't just allow this. It expected it. Historians still argue whether this intrusion was born from legal necessity or moral surveillance, but the system worked with eerie precision. The postman delivers a letter to your house. The servant hands it to your husband. He glances at the handwriting. If he approves, it reaches you. If he doesn't, it vanishes. And your reply might never leave the house. Let's say you write to your childhood friend, nothing scandalous, just memories. Maybe you mention feeling lonely. Maybe you mention your husband's recent mood swings. Nothing dramatic. But your husband reads it. He folds the letter quietly, then tells you not to write her again. She fills your head with nonsense, he says. And if you do write again, he tears the letter in front of you. Or worse, he waits until you've sealed it, then opens it with a letter knife in plain view, eyes unmoved. I have a right to know what you're saying, he says. And he does. In fact, the courts would agree. Let's not pretend this was rare. Victorian advice manuals encouraged husbands to monitor their wives' mail. The Husband's Domestic Guide, a popular 1857 publication, includes an entire chapter titled The Vigilant Eye, warning men about dangerous correspondence and advising them to maintain awareness of every exchange penned beneath their roof. A fringe tidbit. Some men didn't just read their wives' letters, they annotated them, scribbled critiques in the margins. Do not exaggerate. This is improper. Why are you mentioning our finances? One court case from 1865 included a husband's marginal notes used as evidence of marital correction. Your words monitored and corrected like schoolwork. Except school children had more leeway. What about love letters? If you were suspected of impropriety, even emotional indiscretion, he had every right to demand the return of those letters and use them as evidence in court. And remember, you couldn't defend yourself. Your letters were admissible. Your voice was not. One infamous divorce case in 1873 involved a woman named Helen Montclair. Her husband discovered old letters from a man she'd known before marriage tucked away in a sewing box. They were romantic, but innocent. He used them to argue that she had entered marriage under false pretense. The judge agreed. She lost her inheritance rights. Never mind that the letters were a decade old. Your past wasn't safe. Your mailbox wasn't yours. And if you tried to be clever, used aliases, secret addresses, friendly intermediaries, he could still get to them. Servants were loyal to him. Postmasters could be bribed or threatened. And if he truly wanted, he could accuse you of fraud or deceit. A few women even found themselves accused of subversive plotting for attempting to send letters through friends. Now imagine needing to send a message that matters. Not gossip, not poetry. Something urgent. A plea for help. You write it late at night, fingers shaking. You address it carefully. You hide it beneath your petticoat. You wait until the maid is distracted. You slip out to the garden gate where the postboy passes. And then 3 days later, your husband says, "Who's Martha?" Your stomach turns. The letter never left. Or it did, but he intercepted the reply. Martha will never come. No one will. Let's step sideways a moment. Say your husband is engaged in fraud or crime. You discover it. You try to warn someone, maybe a solicitor, maybe a relative. He finds the draft. He threatens you. You are now untrustworthy, and your attempt to seek help is evidence of mental instability. Why else would you accuse your own husband? Your own truth on paper becomes his weapon. Even letters written to your children could be taken. If you were separated or divorced, any attempt to reach them by mail could be blocked by him. In one documented case from 1878, a mother was arrested for sending unauthorized letters to her son. She slipped them into his school books through a sympathetic governess. The father sued the governess for subversion. She was fired. The mother was fined, the crime corresponding with her child. Let's pause for a real quote from the Edinburgh Law Review, 1864. A man has sovereign right to determine what enters and exits the household, including sentiments written by his wife lest she become an unruly voice in the world. That wasn't satire. That was legal philosophy, and all the while society reinforced it. Even novels of the period romanticized the silenced wife. She pines, she writes. Her letters are intercepted. Her tragedy is aesthetic, not unjust. She dies of heartbreak and readers sigh, but never ask why her words had to pass through his hands. So tonight, as you draft an email or send a text without fear, without asking permission, without your message being opened and judged and dissected by someone who believes they own your voice, pause and marvel. Because in Victorian England, your envelope was a confession, your handwriting a risk, and your mailbox his. The room smells of dust and lime polish. You stand in the stiff heat of a courthouse gallery, hem brushing your ankles, hands gloved and trembling. You don't want to be here, not because you're afraid of the truth, but because you already know what it will cost. You watch as the bailiff carries in a folder. Your name is on it. So is a list of accusations of immorality, of ungovernable temperament, of a certain letter found in your drawer. But you're not here to tell your side. You're here to be discussed. Because in Victorian England, public humiliation was a legal tool, and for wives it was sharpened by gender. Divorce, separation, or even rumor turned into public trials not just of conduct, but of character. And while a husband might be accused of infidelity or cruelty in mild, almost apologetic terms, a wife was flayed in print, in court, and in whispers. With precision, with appetite. She was not just wrong, she was rotten. And worse still, she couldn't fight back. Divorce trials in the 19th century were often open to the public. Spectators gathered like theatergoers crammed into galleries to hear scandalous testimony. Newspapers covered every detail, not just the rulings, but the tone of your voice, the tears you shed, the color of your dress, the number of your lovers, real or rumored. You didn't just lose a case, you lost your privacy. Let's say your husband files for divorce. He claims you've had an affair, no solid evidence, just a hunch, a glance, maybe a letter he swears he didn't forge. You show up to court, but you're not permitted to testify. Not really, and even if you were, the courtroom isn't interested in legal nuance. They want your diary, your letters, your corset size, the fringe tidbit for tonight. Some trials went as far as producing laundry receipts and corsetry invoices to prove that a woman had been living beyond her virtue. One 1873 trial included a full report of the wife's perfume preferences used as evidence that she was vain and desirous of male attention. Her scent betrayed her, or so they said. Now imagine you're innocent. You've never strayed. But your husband is wealthy, well-connected, and most importantly, believable. He cries on cue. He describes you as unstable, cold, dramatic. The court nods. The gallery tuts. The newspapers run headlines that read, "Wife's coldness drove husband to seek affection elsewhere." Your virtue is now officially debatable. And here's the kicker: the legal system actively prevented you from defending yourself. If you tried to publish a rebuttal libel, if you wrote a memoir obscenity, if you gave an interview scandal, you could be sued for trying to clear your name while your husband could parade your alleged sins through the courtroom like a magic act. Let's look at a real case, Tarleton versus Tarleton, 1865, Mrs. Tarleton was accused of flirting with a family friend. Her husband filed for divorce. He presented a hotel ledger with her name, though the handwriting didn't match, and testimony from a disgruntled former maid. Mrs. Tarleton wasn't allowed to testify. She submitted a written statement. The court dismissed it as subjective rhetoric. Her husband won the case. She lost her home, her children, and her social standing. Later, it was discovered that the maid had been bribed. But the ruling stood. The moral truth didn't matter. Reputation did. And reputation was a male-guarded gate. There's another layer here. Even if your husband lost the case, if he was found guilty of cruelty or adultery, you were still punished by association. Your name was still in the papers. Your domestic failure still public record. You might be awarded separation, maybe a meager stipend, but your dignity, that's a separate issue, not addressed by the court. There's a phrase found in a legal review from 1870. The courtroom is not a refuge for dignity, but a site of necessary exposure. Necessary apparently only for women. Let's go deeper. You're in the witness box. The court allows you to speak. But the judge interrupts often. The opposing lawyer smirks as you answer. Every word you say is twisted. Were you cold to your husband? What did you mean by unsatisfied? Why did you walk with that man on that street? Do you deny being seen at dusk near a gentleman's home? And then the worst question. Do you consider yourself a moral woman, madam? There is no right answer. Because if you say yes, you're proud, deluded. And if you say no, you're condemned by your own mouth. So you go quiet. You look at your gloves. You imagine absurdly what it would be like to vanish through the floorboards, to become mist, to escape the room before they call your governess, your seamstress, your sister, your footman, each ready to testify about your tone, your temper, your choice in slippers. One woman, Charlotte L., was divorced for unsuitable enthusiasm toward modern novels. Her husband claimed she became unfit for domestic life after reading Middlemarch. He brought the book to court as evidence. The judge agreed. Let's not forget the printed aftermath. Victorian tabloids, the penny satirist, the illustrated police news. Even the Times thrived on lurid divorce coverage. They published courtroom sketches of weeping wives and smug husbands. They quoted out-of-context lines from letters. One headline read, "Wife of weeping fits and unladylike whispers." That was the only description of her misconduct. Now imagine walking into a shop the next day. People glance, whisper. One woman stares too long. You turn around and leave without buying anything. Because your name has become a story, a cautionary tale, a headline pinned to a woman-shaped body. And if you think silence will save you, it won't. Because even women who chose not to defend themselves were still dragged through the press. She offered no denial, one paper wrote of a divorced woman in 1872, perhaps, because there was none to offer. Her silence became her confession, her restraint, her rope. So tonight, as you lie safe from spectacle behind the closed door of your own choosing, take a moment to honor something quietly radical, that you can defend yourself in your own voice, that if your name appears somewhere, you have the right to answer it, to shape it, to reclaim it. Because in Victorian England, he accused, she was exposed, and dignity that was a luxury reserved for men. You sit stiffly at the back of the chapel, hands clasped, shoulders tense. Your children are beside you, still and silent, their clothes too warm for the afternoon heat. The sermon drones on, but you barely hear it. You're waiting. Because after this, there will be a conversation. Not with you, with your husband. The vicar will take him aside to discuss the new confirmation classes. He'll make choices about the children's lessons, about which Bible they'll read, about how your family will worship. You won't be asked. Because in Victorian England, your husband determined your religion, and by law and custom, you were expected to follow his lead. And if you didn't, the consequences could ripple through every corner of your life, from strained marriages to lost children to excommunication. Your faith, your beliefs, your inner voice were subject to his conviction. This wasn't just household tradition. It had roots in legal precedent and the assumption of marital unity, where unity meant uniformity, and that uniformity was his. He was the religious head of the household. You were its moral reflection. Obedience wasn't just about chores or conversation, it extended into the soul. Historians still argue whether this enforcement came more from ecclesiastical authority or legal silence, but the effect was simple and stifling. You did not get to choose your religion once you married. You adopted his. Or you made war in your own home. Let's say you were raised Catholic. He's Anglican. You marry hoping for compromise. You quickly learn that compromise is a ghost talked about, never seen. Your children are baptized in his church. You are expected to kneel beside him on Sundays. If you hesitate, if you choose not to attend, that's cause for suspicion, for gossip, for sermons aimed at you from the pulpit. And the law backs it. One woman, Eliza Bartram, tried to keep her Catholic devotions after marrying a Protestant solicitor. She lit candles in her private parlor, read scripture in Latin, prayed with her rosary. He stormed in one night and smashed the crucifix she'd kept since childhood. Then he forbade her from speaking to their children about foreign doctrine. She wrote to a bishop for support. The bishop replied with caution, "Your obedience in marriage must not jeopardize household harmony." Harmony, of course, meant silence. Here's your fringe tidbit. In some parishes, clergy were instructed not to visit households where the wife was of a different faith, unless the husband gave consent. So if you wanted communion counsel or confession, you had to ask him first. And if he refused, your soul was on its own. Let's say you resist. Quietly at first. You pray in secret. You read books he disapproves of. You teach your children certain verses softly at night. If he finds out, he might scold you, or he might accuse you of religious corruption, a term with actual legal weight in custody disputes. That's right, if a husband claimed you were introducing unauthorized religious teachings to the children, he could make the case for sole custody and win. And that wasn't theoretical. It happened. There's a documented 1871 case in which a mother lost custody of her children after she sent them to a Catholic school behind her Anglican husband's back. His argument, she was distorting their moral compass. The court agreed. He told the judge she taught them saints' names. She wept. It didn't matter. And if the roles were reversed, if you converted to his faith and later regretted it, too late. One woman married to a Methodist converted under pressure, then tried to return to her childhood Anglican roots after their separation. Her former church refused her communion on the grounds that she had vowed unity in another flock. Her husband's church, her spiritual home, was no longer hers. And even if you belonged to the same general faith, say, both Protestants, you could still be seen as theologically disobedient if you questioned his interpretations. Imagine trying to discuss Genesis and being told that's not for wives to dissect. Imagine quoting Paul and hearing, "Don't get clever." One husband, whose sermons were printed and distributed, referred to his wife's attempts to contribute to his theological reflections as intellectual overreach. She eventually stopped speaking in church altogether. When asked why, she replied, "Because I was told my mouth was not part of our doctrine." Let that echo. Even baptism became a battleground. Victorian law didn't explicitly block mothers from having their children baptized in their own denomination, But church leaders often refused if the father objected. And if you dared to baptize your child in secret, that act could be considered parental sabotage. Your child's name, their godparents, their spiritual path, it was all his decision. Your resistance asterisked, marginal, and what if you entirely refused church? Refused to raise your children in any tradition that wasn't seen as independence. That was neglect. Some husbands used it to accuse wives of moral failing, of lacking discipline, of abandoning their maternal sanctity. One judge in 1884 wrote, "A wife who eschews the spiritual order of her home forfeits her authority within it." That was the court's verdict, not a priest's, a judge's. Now let's talk holidays. Christmas, Easter, the feast days. You might have your own ways of marking the seasons. Songs from your childhood, foods, rites. But the moment you marry, those traditions are optional only if they don't contradict his, and if they do, they vanish. You might light a candle for All Souls' Day and be called superstitious. You might hang a different ornament and be corrected. One woman tried to celebrate the feast of St. Agnes. Her husband said it was rural nonsense and forbade the children from participating. She wept alone in the kitchen. Her daughter would later write, "That was the last candle my mother lit." So tonight, as you speak your truth in your own heart, as you kneel or don't on your own terms, in your own faith or your own doubt, remember, there was a time when your beliefs were not yours, when your prayers were regulated, when your soul was his jurisdiction. Because in Victorian England, God might see you, but the law saw only your husband. You're standing in the kitchen apron, dusted with flour arms, elbow deep in dough. The air smells of yeast and soap, and the copper kettle whistles softly. Somewhere upstairs, your husband coughs once. You pause. Because dinner must be ready at exactly 6, and the firewood must be stacked in a particular pattern, and the hallway rug must lie flat, not slightly askew, or he'll notice. You're not the maid. Not on paper. But you may as well be. Because in Victorian England, even if you were a wife with social status, your legal and domestic role was often indistinguishable from that of a servant. You weren't paid and you couldn't quit. Your labor was expected. Your role was obedience. And the law had nothing to say about it. You were housekeeper, cook, laundress, seamstress, governess, nurse, emotional buffer, and personal secretary, all wrapped into one unpaid, unrecognized role. The husband, meanwhile, was the head of household, a phrase that sounded dignified, but really meant he decided everything. Historians still argue whether this unpaid labor was acknowledged as domestic contribution or merely dismissed as feminine duty. But the result is clear: you worked constantly, and the only thing you earned was more expectation. Let's picture your day. You rise before him. You light the fire or make sure someone does. You prepare breakfast. You check that the children are clean. You give the servants instructions. You hem your daughter's dress, mend your husband's shirt, check the pantry, write the household accounts, and send a note to the butcher. Then you sit down for tea. And if you dare look tired, he might frown and say, "You've hardly done anything today." That's because the law didn't see your work as work. Legally, it didn't count. You had no claim to compensation, no legal protections for overwork, no entitlement to rest. You couldn't strike. You couldn't negotiate. You weren't an employee. You were a wife, which in legal terms meant labor without rights. Let's say you want help. You request a second maid. Your husband says no, that's the end of it. You are expected to do more with less. The guests still arrive. The linen must still be pressed. The pudding must not be too dark, nor the wine too warm. If something goes wrong, that's your fault. Here's a fringe tidbit: some husbands kept household scorecards. literally. Small ledgers tracking domestic tasks and errors, scorched bread, dusty floorboards, unseemly breakfast silences. One ledger from 1875 includes a tally of mistimed meals with an actual fine imposed no coal allowance for 3 days. She'd been married for 11 years. Now imagine this: your husband becomes ill. You nurse him day and night, wipe his brow, administer laudanum, sit through fevered rants. He recovers. You collapse from exhaustion. He goes hunting the next day. You're left to make the soup, and no one says you've done enough, because care wasn't something you gave. It was something he was owed. Let's talk terminology. A servant's labor was measured in wages. A wife's labor was measured in silence. If you complained, you were spoiled. If you asked for help, you were weak. If you collapsed, you were melancholic. One etiquette guide from 1862 cheerily advised that a devoted wife must not speak of effort, for effort is the invisible glue of a happy home. Glue. Think about that. Even middle-class and upper-class wives, those with servants and staff, weren't immune. They managed the managers, oversaw every order, every delivery, every schedule, and still had to look rested and serene at every dinner party. You couldn't be seen working, but if the house failed, it was your disgrace. Let's move lower down the social ladder. If you were working class, the line between wife and servant was practically invisible. You cleaned, cooked, and raised children, and possibly worked outside the home too, in a mill or laundry. When you returned, your real work began. If your husband drank or loafed or spent your earnings, too bad. You were expected to maintain order even if you had to pawn your shawl to do it. And the law would never call it labor. Because you didn't clock in. You didn't sign a contract. You didn't matter. One working-class wife in 1883 wrote in her diary, "There is no word for what I do. I do it before they wake and after they sleep, and it is called nothing. And nothing is what you'd get in return. Want time off? There was no such thing. Want privacy? Good luck. Your husband could walk into any room any moment. Want appreciation? Maybe you'd get a nod. Maybe not." One woman worked 17 years managing a farm household. Her husband thanked her once at his funeral in a note to their sons. "Your mother kept the bread on the table. Respect her as I now do. Too little, too late. And let's not pretend this went unnoticed." Feminist reformers of the time did speak out. Mary Wollstonecraft, decades earlier, had called marriage legal prostitution, a trade of service for protection. By the mid-19th century, writers like Harriet Taylor Mill and Caroline Norton were openly describing housewifery as unrecognized labor. But society shrugged. The courts, they were worse. A wife who stopped performing domestic tasks could be accused of abandonment, even if she still lived in the house. One 1869 case ruled a wife deficient in conjugal duty for refusing to do laundry after her husband insulted her in public. He said, "She stopped folding my shirts." The judge nodded gravely. And if he locked you out of the kitchen, took over hiring the cook, that wasn't control. It was intervention in disorder. Your work could be taken from you, or demanded, or dismissed, but never protected. Tonight, as you step away from dishes that wash themselves, or order groceries with a click, or simply choose not to cook, take a moment to think of her. The woman who ironed shirts with trembling hands, who smiled through dinner despite burns on her wrist, who folded, scrubbed, mended, stirred, soothed, and was never once told thank you. Because in Victorian England, a wife didn't help run the house. She was the house. The architecture, the insulation, and the unpaid staff. You hear the whimper before you even reach the garden. It's a small, pathetic sound, barely a cry. You round the hedge and stop. Your dog, your little spaniel Clover, cowers beside the well, her coat muddy, her ear torn. She limps towards you, whines, tries to climb into your lap. You look up. Your husband is wiping his hands on a cloth. "She was barking again," he says. "I warned you." You open your mouth, but what can you say? You know what comes next. He can do what he wants. And the law agrees. Because in Victorian England, even your pets weren't truly yours. Legally, they belonged to your husband, just like your furniture, your jewelry, your earnings, your home. And yes, even your animals. He could sell them, give them away, kill them. And you had no legal right to object. It's easy to forget now in a time when dogs and cats are family members that for much of history, animals were treated strictly as property. But under coverture, your property was his property. And that included the creature that slept at your feet, warmed your lap, listened to your secrets. Historians still argue whether this was a simple extension of property law or part of a broader attempt to minimize female autonomy by eliminating every possible independent connection. Either way, the result was heartbreakingly routine. A woman loved a pet, her husband didn't, and the outcome wasn't negotiated, it was decided. By him. Always him. Let's say you bring home a cat, a stray. You feed it in the pantry, let it curl up in your basket of needlepoint. You don't ask for permission, you just want something to care for. When he finds out, he says, "Not in my house." You protest. He says, "Then you choose me or the cat." It's not really a choice. You know what happens to that cat. One fringe tidbit. In an 1862 police report from Kent, a woman tried to report her husband for killing her parrot. The officer, trying not to laugh, told her she had no standing. The parrot, he reminded her, was a gentleman's possession. She left the station in tears. And the cruelty wasn't always physical. Sometimes it was transactional. Imagine training a dog, loving it for years, only to wake one morning and find it gone. Sold, given away, shipped to a cousin in Yorkshire, all without warning, all without discussion. One woman wrote in her diary in 1878, "He sold Felix for 10 shillings. I would have paid 20 to keep him, but the coins in my drawer were not my own. He said it was time I learned detachment." Felix was a greyhound. He had arthritis. He didn't survive the journey. The law was crystal clear unless an animal was explicitly listed in a separate marriage contract or trust exceptionally rare. The husband could dispose of it however he pleased. That included selling, giving away, or destroying. It was no different than a chair or a coat. And even if the pet was yours before marriage, it became his afterward. The moment you said, "I do," that little bundle of fur you raised from a pup ceased to be yours in any legal sense. Want to challenge it in court? Good luck. The few women who tried were laughed out of the courtroom. One London barrister wrote in a legal journal, "The woman who makes a fuss over a dog risks making a mockery of herself and of this court." Let's make that clearer. The grief was yours. The mockery also yours. The power never yours. And this wasn't just about pets. It was about control. Pets were companions, creatures of loyalty, affection, and comfort. And for many Victorian wives cut off from family, restricted in movement, silenced in court, their dog or cat or bird was the only thing that offered unconditional love. So of course, husbands took them away, or hurt them, or got rid of them as punishment. Not because they disliked animals, but because they liked watching you lose something you couldn't protect. Even kind husbands, well-kind, understood the rule. If he liked the dog, it stayed. If he didn't, it didn't. There was no sharing, no compromise. One etiquette book even included this advice: a wife may attend to household pets as her husband permits. But she must not place undue sentiment upon beasts, lest her affections wander from her proper place. Let's translate that: if you love a dog too much, you might forget who owns you. And this power dynamic played out again and again. A barking dog led to confinement. A meowing cat was banished to the stables. A parrot that repeated, "Don't shout," mysteriously disappeared. A rabbit escaped in the night. Children noticed. One little girl wrote in a letter to her cousin, "Father says pets are for girls without opinions. I think he's wrong, but I cannot say it." Mother cried when Toby died, but not when he fell. Only when father said he'd been noisy. That girl never saw another pet again. You might be wondering, were there any protections? A few, but only for animals in general, not animals owned by women. The 1822 Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act protected livestock. The later 1876 Cruelty to Animals Act focused on vivisection. But nothing prevented a husband from euthanizing the family dog or starving the canary, as long as it was his. So tonight, as your pet sleeps safely at your feet or curled beside your pillow, protected by laws, by custom, by a leash and a collar in your name, remember her, the Victorian wife who whispered bedtime secrets to a creature that couldn't talk back. The one who trained it, fed it, buried it when it vanished. The one who held its memory like a talisman in a world where even affection was rationed. Because in Victorian England, your pet was never truly yours. And when it vanished, you weren't just losing an animal. You were losing the last thing that loved you freely. You're at the market moving carefully between barrels of oats and bundles of lavender fingers, grazing fabric you can't afford. Behind you, two women are speaking in hushed tones. "She's barren," one whispers. "Been years now," the other sighs. "She must be a disappointment." You stiffen. They don't name you, but you know. The silence around your dinner table, the looks exchanged at family gatherings, the tension in your husband's jaw whenever someone else announces a new birth. It all points in one direction. You have not produced an heir. And in Victorian England, that was your greatest failure. Because childbearing wasn't just expected of you. It was your duty, moral, marital, and legal. Your worth was measured in children, preferably male, preferably many. If you couldn't produce them, you weren't simply pitied. You were degraded. You were defective. Historians still argue whether this pressure was biologically rational or entirely social in its construction. But the fact remains, a wife who failed to conceive or lost children or birthed only girls risked everything. Her marriage, her reputation, her safety. Let's start with the hard truth. Infertility was always the woman's fault. There were no tests, no science-based evaluations, no sympathetic doctors. If the marriage bed stayed cold, the blame fell squarely on your womb, even when it wasn't your fault. And the word they used, barren. A word so dry, so cracked with judgment, it seemed designed to sting. You weren't just without children, you were a failed field, a patch of useless soil, a garden that would not bloom. And men did not build futures in barren land. If your husband was kind, he might simply grow distant, silent, withdraw to his study or to his club, avoiding your gaze as if childlessness were contagious. If he wasn't kind, he'd say it aloud. I married for a family, he might sneer, not just company. Sometimes he'd say worse. Sometimes he wouldn't speak at all. Fringe tidbit. In 1877, a woman was sent to a private asylum not for any overt symptoms of madness, but because she cried uncontrollably after her third miscarriage. Her husband told the doctor she was unfit for social life due to hysteria. The doctor agreed. She was institutionalized for nearly 5 years. When she returned, childless and changed, he had already taken a mistress. Want to talk legal rights? You had none. If a husband wanted to claim his wife's infertility as grounds for annulment or separation, the court sometimes permitted it, especially among the upper classes where heirs and estates were at stake. A baron might argue that his lineage must continue, and if you had no children, you became replaceable. One chilling court document from 1861 reads, "The wife has produced no issue in 6 years' time despite lawful attempts. Her husband may be permitted to seek fertility elsewhere." No mention of his health, no mention of affection. Just no issue. Just a sterile ledger entry. And if you did have children but they died, that was sometimes worse. Because then the whispers carried an edge. Maybe she's cursed, maybe she's careless, maybe she doesn't deserve children. One woman lost 2 infants in a single winter. Her husband told neighbors she was prone to melancholy and poor with blankets, as if grief were a skill she failed to master. You didn't get sympathy, you got suspicion. Let's zoom in for a moment. You're in a cramped doctor's office, laced tightly in your best dress. The doctor asks questions, but not about your cycle, not about ovulation or hormones or anatomy. He asks about your temper, your appetite, whether you resist your husband's advances. He asks if you read too many books, if you pray too little. Then he prescribes quiet walks and bitter tonics, maybe a lech. No one suggests your husband be examined. Even when pregnancies did occur, the pressure didn't vanish. A woman who bore only daughters might be teased, scolded, even blamed. One gentleman famously toasted his wife at a dinner party with the line, "To the hope she'll finally provide trousers instead of lace." She was 6 months pregnant, with her 4th daughter, and the courts silent. There were no protections for a woman accused of failure to produce. No recourse if her husband threatened to take a mistress or already had. No privacy from the speculation of neighbors who tallied your years of marriage and noted the absence of prams. You might be mocked in newspapers. One tabloid ran the headline, "Lady Grey, still without cradle husband, hunts abroad." The implication wasn't subtle, the consequences even less so. So you try things, teas, herbs, strange positions. You visit midwives who whisper secrets and pray over your belly. You sleep with your knees up. You track the moon. You cry in private. But every month, the same silence. And the house grows colder. Some women desperate tried to borrow children, took in foundlings, claimed them as nephews. Sometimes their husbands went along with it, sometimes not. One woman adopted a baby secretly only for her husband to have the child removed by force. He told the court he refused to raise false hope from another man's seed. The child was placed in an orphanage. She never saw him again. Now imagine just for a moment that your body had worked differently, that you'd had 3 sons in quick succession. Do you know what they'd call you? A success, a miracle, a blessing. All the same traits you already have, your mind, your heart, your strength, now suddenly worthy because your womb cooperated. That's the cruelty. You didn't change. Their opinion did. So tonight, as you hold your freedom close, as you define your worth in your own terms, remember her. The woman who bled quietly into rags, who folded away tiny dresses for children who never came, who smiled through baby showers that were never hers. Because in Victorian England, your womb was a contract. And if it didn't deliver, you were already returned. The envelope is crisp, the wax still warm when you break the seal. You unfold the letter slowly, hands trembling. Your uncle has died. He leaves behind a modest estate, a cottage, some coin, a parcel of land, and in the letter he names you. You, specifically. His favorite niece. The one who brought him soup when he was sick. The one who read to him when his eyes went bad. But as you read down the page, the warmth fades, because he left it to you, but through your husband. In Victorian England, you couldn't inherit property independently if you were married. Not land, not homes, not even jewelry. It all went to him automatically. You could not legally own anything. You could not sign for anything. And if someone dared to try and give you something, it would be seized by the law of coverture, that old insidious clause that followed you everywhere like a shadow. Your name might be on the will, the parcel, the deed. But make no mistake, you had no legal claim to it. The moment it passed to your hands, it passed to his pockets. And if you thought love would protect it, think again. Historians still argue whether this automatic forfeiture was rooted in logistical convenience or deliberate female disempowerment. What's certain is, this unmarried woman in 1850 had fewer property rights than an unmarried barmaid, because the barmaid at least could sign her name and open a bank account. You were invisible to the registry. Let's say you inherit a cottage. You imagine it could be your retreat, a little space of your own, away from your husband's sharp tongue or the endless obligations of housework. But no. The law sees that cottage as his property to do with as he pleases. He might sell it, rent it, move a mistress into it, or just to make a point, let it rot, and you would have no say. Because legally, it was never yours. One fringe tidbit. In a much-discussed 1867 case, a woman inherited a pair of pearl earrings from her mother. They'd been in her family for generations. Her husband gave them to his mistress. The wife protested, even offered to buy them back. The court ruled that he had the legal right to dispose of his wife's jewelry as he sees fit, provided the items were not secured by premarital trust. Translation: the pearls were his the moment he slipped the wedding ring on her finger. There were a few workarounds. Wealthy families sometimes used marriage settlements, contracts that placed inherited property in trust, protected from the husband's control. But these were rare, and they were only accessible to those with lawyers' influence and fathers who thought ahead. If you didn't have that, your wealth became his weapon. Let's imagine another case. You inherit a sum of money. Not much, maybe enough to start a modest business, a small dress shop, a bookstore. You're clever, practical. You know your clients. But when you suggest the idea, your husband laughs. He says, you'd rather run a shop than care for this house. Then he uses your inheritance to settle his debts, or invest in a railway, or buy a new horse. And when it fails, you're the one blamed for being imprudent. Even your clothing wasn't legally yours. Dresses, shoes, shawls, all could be taken or sold by your husband. A woman once sued for the return of her wedding gown after her husband sold it to pay off his tailor. The judge ruled that it belonged to the household purse. The tailor kept the gown, but he did send a note of apology, tucked in a pocket. Now what about widows? There's some hope there. A widow could under certain conditions inherit property directly, but even that came with caveats. If she remarried, the cycle began anew. And some wills explicitly stated that a woman would lose her property upon second marriage, lest it pass to an unworthy man. Imagine that. Even in death, her father tried to guard her from husbands. Some fathers, anticipating this horror, wrote bizarre conditions into their daughters' inheritances. Shall receive the sum only if she remains unmarried. Shall retain property unless she weds beneath her station. One man left his daughter a small manor with this note: may she live free of chains unless she chooses them. The house was eventually seized by her second husband. Want to really feel the injustice if a woman earned money, say as a writer or painter or governess, that income also legally belonged to her husband. Charlotte Bronte's earnings from Jane Eyre. Technically, not hers. Had she married before publication, her royalties could have been claimed spent and squandered by a man with no knowledge of plot or prose. It wasn't just about land. It was about legacy. Let's step into your shoes again. You receive a family heirloom, a brooch, a ring, a letter. It was meant for you. It was entrusted to your care. But if your husband demands it, the law says you must hand it over. If he pawns it, that's his right. If you hide it, that's fraud. You can't win, unless you never marry at all. And that's the terrible irony. Unmarried women in Victorian England had far more legal autonomy than wives. They could sue, own property, bequeath, control their earnings. The moment they married, all that vanished. Marriage wasn't a merger, it was an absorption. So tonight, as you look around your space, whether it's rented or owned, or simply yours in spirit, feel that quiet, defiant joy. You can open a bank account. You can write a will. You can inherit something and keep it. No one can sell your earrings or your house without your signature. Because in Victorian England, a wife didn't lose her property. She never had it. Only a ring, and a ledger full of debts she didn't make. You sit at the writing desk, pen hovering above crisp paper. You've spent the day considering every word. The tone must be calm, the language measured. No accusations, no complaints. Just the plain truth: I can't do this anymore. You are planning to leave. But as the ink begins to flow, the reality settles around you like fog. You have nowhere to go. And if you leave without his permission, you lose everything. Because in Victorian England, a wife who left her husband, no matter the reason, was legally considered a deserter. And deserters had no rights, no children, no income, no protection, no name. Once you walked out that door, you didn't just become single. You became a fugitive of your own marriage. Historians still argue whether this punitive treatment was designed to uphold marital sanctity or to reinforce male dominance. But the result is chillingly consistent: Victorian wives who fled even from cruelty. Violence or madness were punished not for leaving a bad man, but for leaving at all. Let's say you do it. You pack a carpet bag in the dark, tuck a few coins into your sleeve, and take the early train to your sister's house. Your husband wakes up alone. He's furious. But what happens next isn't just private rage. He can report you. He can cut off your access to money. He can take your children from you permanently. He can even accuse you of abandonment and have you brought back like property gone missing. And the court will nod along. Because under coverture, you had no legal right to choose separation without his consent. You were his wife, his dependent, his lawful appendage. Leaving wasn't an act of bravery, it was a breach of contract. Let's zoom in on the children for a moment. By law, he had full custody. You bore them, nursed them, sang to them in fevers, but he could remove them from your care with a single court order. And he didn't even need to prove you were unfit, just absent. In one 1872 case, a woman left her husband after he struck her with a walking stick. She took their 2 sons to her mother's home. He arrived 2 days later with the constable and a writ. The boys were returned to him. She was warned never to attempt contact without his permission. She wrote to them every birthday. The letters were never delivered. Fringe tidbit. There were private retrieval agents who specialized in finding runaway wives. Paid in coin or favors, they tracked women through train stations, boarding houses, charities. If you thought anonymity could protect you, it couldn't. Your husband could have you followed, and if he didn't, the newspapers might. Public shaming was part of the mechanism. Ads in local papers. My wife Louisa having left my bed and board, I am not responsible for her debts. These notices weren't about money. They were about branding you. Once your name appeared in print like that, every shopkeeper, landlady, and seamstress in town would turn you away. You were no longer a woman. You were a scandal. Even if you had a place to go, the law wouldn't follow you there. You could not sign a lease. You could not open an account. You could not register a child for school. If someone offered you shelter, they could be sued for interference in a lawful marriage. One widow took in her niece after she escaped a violent husband. He sued her for harboring a married woman without consent. The court fined her. She paid. The niece was returned. And what if you had money of your own, rare but possible? You might have a few pounds tucked away, maybe jewelry to pawn, maybe a friend with a soft heart. But you had no legal access to joint funds, no claim to household accounts. If he froze the purse strings, you starved. One woman described it this way: I escaped the fire only to find there were no doors in the world that would open to a burning woman. And if you thought divorce was the answer, think again. A man could file for divorce based solely on adultery. A woman, she had to prove adultery and cruelty or incest or desertion or life-threatening abuse. Not suspicion, not bruises, not locked doors. The burden of proof was deliberately stacked high. And even if she did win, which was rare, she would likely lose custody and face social ruin. Divorce was legal poison, slow, public, irreversible. Most women simply endured. Let's picture a quieter resistance. You stay. You don't leave. But you move into a separate room. You stop sharing meals. You say little. You knit quietly at the window, watching the world pass by without your name in it. You are not a wife in any active sense, but still tethered to the role by law and lace. Even that emotional departure was risky. He might call you cold. He might accuse you of neglect. He might claim you're withdrawing conjugal obligation. That's not a poetic phrase. That's legal language. It meant that your withdrawal could be seen as abandonment, even though you never stepped outside the house. A woman once asked a judge if she could simply stop loving her husband. The judge replied, "That is not your concern. Love is not the issue. Duty is." And duty, as always, had a single name: his. There were women who succeeded, who fled disguised, supported by sisters or sympathetic aunts. Some changed towns, names, identities. One ran a boarding house under her maiden initials for 15 years before her husband died, and she could finally call herself Mrs. again, this time for herself. But for everyone who escaped, 100 stayed. So tonight, if you sit in a space of your choosing, no one standing between you and the door, know this. There was a time when walking away meant vanishing completely. When saving yourself meant losing your name, your children, your safety. Because in Victorian England, a wife could not leave. She could only disappear and hope the world forgot the sound of her name. There's a knock at the door. Not hard, just polite enough to unsettle you. You're in the parlor with your embroidery, trying not to flinch. Your husband is upstairs. The maid peeks and whispers. It's the bailiff. You feel the color drain from your face. Because the debts aren't yours. The poor investments aren't yours. But the consequences, oh, they are absolutely yours. In Victorian England, a wife could be held responsible for her husband's debts, but not the other way around. That's the twist in the legal braid. You had no independent financial identity, but creditors could come after you. Your dowry, your possessions, even your family's assets, if they were deemed to have benefited the household. You couldn't sign a contract. You couldn't borrow money. You couldn't own land. But somehow you could still be financially ruined. Historians still argue whether this double bind was a result of scattered legal reforms colliding with outdated moral expectations, or if it was an intentional method of enforcing compliance through dependency. Either way, it was a brilliant trap. You couldn't act independently, yet you paid the price for another's mistakes. Let's step into your shoes. Your husband has been investing railway shares, overseas ventures, speculative trade. You hear him muttering in his study, pacing more than usual. One day he slams a ledger shut, tells you not to worry. 2 weeks later, a man shows up at the door with a writ, a court order. There are debts to settle. If your husband is absent or simply refuses to appear, you might be summoned in his place. Not as a defendant with rights, but as a representative of the marital household. That's how they worded it, representative of the marital household. Like you were the flag atop a sinking ship. Let's get specific. A shopkeeper sells your husband a dozen crates of port. He doesn't pay. The seller sues. You're named in the claim as Mrs. Household, which legally means your dowry or separate property, if you had any, could be liquidated to satisfy the debt. One fringe tidbit. In 1874, a widow discovered that her late husband had mortgaged their estate and named her jewelry as collateral. She had no idea. The court upheld the claim. The necklace was seized. It had been a wedding gift from her mother. Not stolen, not borrowed, reclaimed by law. Now maybe you try to fight back. You seek advice. The solicitor tells you kindly but firmly that your hands are tied. Unless you had a marriage settlement, a rare legal agreement that carved out separate financial rights for wives, you are considered financially merged with your husband. That means his debts are your debts, but your money not necessarily yours. And if you inherited funds, say from an uncle, a godparent, those too could be absorbed into debt recovery unless they were placed in a protected trust. Few women had such trusts. Fewer understood how to create them. Most relied on good men to do the honorable thing. Honor, of course, being subject to stress, alcohol, and gambling. Let's imagine another path. Your husband dies. You grieve. You think finally there may be peace. But the creditors begin arriving. They point at the grandfather clock, at the pianoforte, at the paintings. These were part of the estate, and the estate owes money. You protest. That was a gift from my father. Doesn't matter. Was it listed in a trust? No, then it's gone. A woman in Manchester once watched her bridal veil be auctioned off with her dining set. Even worse, the poor law could be invoked. If you were left destitute, your husband's relatives might be forced to support you, but they could turn around and sue your family, claiming restitution. It was a kind of debt ping-pong, and guess who was the ball? You. And if you dared to try and earn money to settle it yourself. As a married woman, your earnings could still be legally claimed by the estate administrator. That's right. Your embroidery, your writing, your music lessons, they all counted toward your husband's unresolved liabilities. But wait. It gets better. If your husband committed fraud, you could still be implicated even if you had no knowledge of it. A man forged his wife's signature on a bond in 1868. When the bond defaulted, she tried to explain. The court said, as his legal appendage, her name carries assumed consent. Assumed consent. To fraud. You don't even have the option to divorce your way out of this, because as we've seen, divorce required massive proof, huge expense, and even then, didn't necessarily restore your finances. Many divorced women were left destitute unless they had family willing to take them back quietly, shamefully, without ceremony. And if you didn't have such a family, well, that's when the Magdalene homes came in, or the poorhouse, or the convent, or worse, forced remarriage to a man willing to take on your ruin. which is how many women ended up trading one debt-laden marriage for another wrapped in silk and buried in legal rubble. Let's come back to your parlor. The bailiff leaves. You watch him go, clenching the letter. The inventory of goods to be collected includes the desk you inherited from your grandfather, the mirror you bought with the pin money you squirreled away for 5 years, the chair where you gave birth to your second son. All of it. Gone. Not because you borrowed, because he did. And the courts, they shrug. Because in Victorian England, you were a financial ghost. No account, no credit, no claim. Just a name on paper and a price to be paid in teaspoons linens and quiet humiliation. You wake to the sound of boots on gravel. The sun is barely up. Outside, your husband speaks with a man, quick words, sharp gestures. A solicitor, maybe, or a land agent. You sit up slowly, tug your shawl close, and glance at your bedside table. The ink is dry on the letter you wrote last night. You didn't sign it, because you know deep down that no signature of yours matters. Not to him, not to the courts, not to the law. It's the final cruelty of it all in Victorian England. You weren't just second in your own marriage, you were invisible in the eyes of the law. Every legal institution, parliament, courts, police, even the post office, was built on the same foundational idea: a wife had no separate legal identity. She was covered, subsumed by her husband. It was called coverture, and by now you've heard the word echo like a locked door through every story we've told. But in this final stretch of our journey, it's time to face what that really meant in full, unbearable clarity. Coverture meant you could not own property. You could not sign contracts. You could not sue or be sued. You could not testify in court on your own behalf if your husband objected. You could not make a will. You could not even legally exist as a separate entity. Your husband didn't just represent you. He was you, legally speaking. And you were absorbed. Historians still argue whether the architects of coverture truly believed it was protective or merely convenient but to Victorian women, it was neither. It was erasure. And it was enforced from cradle to grave. Let's break that down. As a girl, you had limited freedom, but some visibility. You could inherit from a parent, own a small amount of property, and take part in minor contracts. But the moment you married, poof, that legal status vanished. Whatever you had became his. Whatever you were became his. And the law agreed. One judge wrote in 1854, "The union of marriage makes the woman naught but the reflection of her husband's authority, and in matters of law, her shadow must remain silent." Let's talk about contracts. Say you're smart, resourceful. You negotiate a lease, you rent a shop. You plan to run a tea room, quiet, respectable, practical. But the landlord refuses to sign unless your husband co-signs. Legally, you're not allowed to enter into a binding agreement without him. And if you do, the contract is void, and you could be sued for fraud. One fringe tidbit. In 1863, a woman tried to rent a piano for music lessons. She signed her name. The company delivered it. Her husband objected. He didn't like the sound. He returned it without paying, and when she protested, the company sued her. The court ruled in favor of the company, but only because her husband retroactively gave consent. You see, even her debt needed his permission to exist. What about court? Say you're wronged. Someone cheats you. Someone strikes you. You want justice. But you can't sue in your own name. Your husband must file the claim. And if he doesn't want to, you're out of luck. In one particularly tragic case, a woman was assaulted by a neighbor. She begged her husband to press charges. He refused. He owed the man a favor. She tried to go to court herself. The judge told her, "You are not a separate party under law." She was bruised, but invisible. And it worked both ways. You couldn't be sued either because you were legally considered a dependent. If you accidentally injured someone or defaulted on a promise, he was responsible. Which sounds protective until you realize it made you a permanent legal child. You weren't shielded. You were caged. Even your death wasn't quite yours. If you died intestate without a will, your husband received everything, even things you were only holding for your family. And if you did make a will, unless it was done through a specific pre-marriage settlement, it could be contested or ignored. You lived as his wife. You died as his possession. Some women fought back. They wrote under pseudonyms. They stashed away coins in hollow books. They signed anonymous letters to Parliament. In 1856, a woman published a pamphlet titled, "I Am Not a Shadow," outlining every injustice of coverture. She was never identified. Rumors say her husband burned her copy when he found it. And yet whispers began. Feminist thinkers, Harriet Martineau, Carolyn Norton, Barbara Lee Smith began speaking out. Quietly, then boldly, they lobbied for change, and slowly the laws began to shift. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave some women the right to control their own income and property. But even these changes came too late for most. They lived their entire lives within a system where their names meant nothing, where their consent, their ownership, their voices were background noise only audible if he allowed it. So tonight, as we bring our long-shadowed journey to a close, take a moment to breathe deeply, to feel your signature on the air, your name, your body, your choices, your path. You have rights because others did not. You walk freely because they could not. You are seen because they were made invisible. Because in Victorian England, a wife did not exist, not as herself. She lived through the law's silence. She moved like a ghost in her own house. And when she finally disappeared, the law barely noticed she was ever there at all. The fire's burning low now. The sharp corners of history begin to soften in the glow. The voices we've followed, quiet wives, fierce daughters, determined widows, start to fade into gentle echoes. Their stories aren't just grim reminders. They're signposts, cautionary constellations. Tonight, you've walked 100 miles in shoes never made to run. You've carried silence like a badge, seen love twisted by law, heard the tick of time dragging its heels through parlors, courtrooms, chapels, and empty cradles. But now the world stills. The ghosts retreat into wallpaper patterns and whispered diary lines. And you're here. The room is yours. The door closes softly behind you, not in warning, but in peace. You can own your thoughts. Sign your name. Build your story. No one can intercept your letters. No one can give away your pet. No one can claim your body as an annexed province. So stretch your limbs beneath the quilt. Let your muscles remember this freedom not as theory, but as birthright. Dim the last thought. Let it flicker and go. Breathe. Sink. You made it. And those women carved into the margins rest easier because you're still listening. End of script. Sweet dreams.